First off, I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. You know, our society cannot be all that bad if about 800 people will give up watching Joe Millionaire and Fear Factor to attend a debate on God. My name is Justin Whitaker, and I'm the president of the University of Montana Philosophy Society, one of the sponsors of tonight's event. Before we get started, I'd like to thank a few of the people and organizations responsible for making tonight's event possible. First, Kevin Nisha and Campus Crusade for Christ, the event's co-sponsor. Next, the generous financial support of ASUM, President Dennison, the Philosophy Department, chaired by Burke Townsend, and the Religious Studies Department, chaired by Paul Dietrich. And finally, tonight's event could not have come together without the hard work and dedicated mentoring of distinguished Professor Richard Hull and students including Ali Tabibnejad, James Watson, Mark Czar, and most importantly, Matthew Paulson, whose enthusiasm for this topic is matched only by his modesty. Thank you all. In an interview just last week on NPR, Jennifer Michael Hecht, author of Doubt, A History, was asked if the September 11th attacks on America had prompted a return to faith in our country, as many thought it had or would. She replied that while no, America didn't seem to be growing more faithful, those of devout faith had become noticeably louder in society. And the irreligious, too, are growing ever more verbose. Notably, however, the two groups seem to be growing increasingly partisan, simply gathering soldiers for what many consider to be the new great war in America, the culture war. This event is unique, however, as it seeks not merely to reinforce the views each of you already hold, but also to confront and to question the very foundation of those views. The format for tonight's debate is as follows. We'll have Dr. Richard Swinburne give his opening, followed by Tabash. We'll have then a 10-minute rebuttal by each, followed by an 8-minute rebuttal by each, then 15 minutes of cross-examination by each, and then we'll have a brief intermission in which we'll collect your questions. After that, we will ask your audience questions of the debaters, followed by closing statements by each. We have a long evening ahead of us, so we'll keep the introductions as brief as possible. Eddie Tabash was born and raised in Los Angeles. He is the son of an Auschwitz surviving mother and an Orthodox rabbi father. He graduated from Santa Monica Community College and from UCLA, magna cum laude in 1973. He earned his law degree from Loyola Law School of Los Angeles in 1976. Eddie's been involved in countless organizations over the past 30-plus years, seeking to improve the lives of those around him. He is currently a constitutional and civil rights lawyer in Beverly Hills, California, and a board member of the Council for Secular Humanism. Please now welcome John Rozelle of Campus Crusade for Christ to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you. If you don't already have 3x5 note cards on your chairs, they will be passed shortly, in which you can write questions for the speakers, which they will answer after our intermission. Please address which speaker you would like to answer the question first by writing their name at the top of the card. And at the end of tonight's session, if you could fill out the comment card that is on your seat, just get an idea about what you thought about tonight's debate, and drop it at a bucket by the doors on the way out, that'd be great. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Richard Swinburne. He's recently retired Professor Emeritus of Philosophy of the Christian Religion at Oxford University. He's also a Fellow of the British Academy. He has solely authored 14 books on Christianity and philosophy. I'm not even sure if I've read 14 books, so I think that's pretty impressive. Currently, he's traveling around to different universities teaching. Most recently, he has taught at Yale University. So without further ado, Dr. Richard Swinburne.
Thank you. My reasons for believing in God are that the hypothesis of theism, the claim that there is a God, explains all the most general phenomena of the universe and is by far the simplest and therefore most probably true hypothesis that does. By the general phenomena of the universe, I mean that the existence and action of God explain why there is a universe at all, why it is an orderly universe, that is to say, conforms to simple, intelligible laws of nature, it isn't chaos, why the laws are such as, together with the initial conditions at the time of the Big Bang, to lead to the evolution of human organisms, why these human organisms are conscious and so have souls, why they are morally aware beings, why we are morally aware beings, various phenomena in human history, general phenomena and particular phenomena concerned with the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, and finally, our own religious experiences. It explains everything. Now, let me justify the claim to you that it does. But first, let me state what the hypothesis is. It's the claim there is a God. Now, by God, I mean a personal being who is our creator and sustainer. He brought the universe into being. If it had at the beginning, if it had a beginning, or if it's always existed, he's kept it in being forever. And he's sustained it in existence with its general characteristics. He's a personal being. We are persons, and being a person means having beliefs about things, it means having purposes, trying to do things in the world, and it means having certain limited powers to do them. We can limited powers over our bodies, we have purposes we try and realize through our bodies, and we have beliefs about whether we've succeeded or not and what the world is like. In that sense, God is a person. He too has beliefs, purposes, and makes choices. But unlike us, there are no limits. We have limited powers over our body. He is omnipotent. He can do everything he wants to, everything logically possible. If he wanted to, he could abolish the world just like that. Or he could change the laws of nature so that instead of there being gravity, bodies attracting each other, they repelled each other. Or he could simply raise this stadium into the air. He's omnipotent. He's omniscient. We have some beliefs, some true, some false. He knows everything that's logically possible to know. We have purposes, he has purposes too. But our purposes are limited purposes in the sense that our freedom is limited. We choose things in virtue of there being good things to do, but we are subject to irrational influences of many kinds. We feel ourselves inclined to do all sorts of things that we believe it's not good to do. And so, to some extent, we are caused to do what we do. Not altogether, but we're certainly influenced to do what we do by our genes and environment, and it's hard to fight against them. God is unlimited in this respect. He is not subject to laws. He creates and sustains laws, and he is not subject to any irrational influences at all. So he's omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly free. From that, it follows that he will also be perfectly good, because given that there are truths of morality, and we all think that, except in our vague philosophical moments, we all think that certain things are right and certain things are wrong, given that, an omniscient being will know what those things are. And when you recognize that something is good to do or obligatory, you couldn't recognize that without having some inclination to do it. We weak humans, of course, may give in to rival inclinations of an irrational kind, but God, subject to no irrational influences, recognizing something as good, will automatically do it. And so his perfect goodness follows from his omnipotence, omniscience, and perfect freedom. He is also eternal. He lasts forever. We last for just a short while. Okay, that's the claim. The claim there is a God. That's what it amounts to. The whole of nature is controlled by an all-good, all-knowing being. Why should we believe it to be true? Why should we believe any hypothesis to be true? Let's take a very simple hypothesis. Suppose there's been a burglary. Money has been stolen from a safe. A suspect, John, was seen near the scene of the crime, time it was committed. His fingerprints were found on the safe. A lot of money was found stowed away in his garage. Well, it rather looks as if the evidence suggests that John has done the crime. Why does the evidence suggest that? Well, I suggest for three reasons. First, because the three pieces of evidence, the data, are such as you would expect to find if the hypothesis is true. If he did rob the safe, you would expect to find his fingerprints on it, the money in the garage, and so on. If the hypothesis is false, you wouldn't expect to find these data. If he didn't rob the safe, you wouldn't expect to find his fingerprints on it, the money in his garage, and so on. And the third criterion is all important. It is the simplest hypothesis of which that is true. It's no good saying that a hypothesis is true simply if, were it true, you would expect the data, and were it false, you wouldn't, because there are always an infinite number of hypotheses of which that will be the case. Let me suggest to you another hypothesis which will equally well explain the three clues which I have mentioned. The hypothesis is John had nothing to do with the robbery. Somebody else, George, who had a grudge against John, managed to get hold of his fingerprints and to put them on the safe by some transfer from a sticky substance device. Somebody else, who, quite by accident, Robinson, stole some money in another crime and hid it in John's garage. Now, if it was the case that George did this deceptive act and John was near the scene of the crime and Robinson had put the money in the garage, if all that's true, then you would also expect to find all the three clues which I mentioned, and you wouldn't expect to find them otherwise. But clearly, that's not a very good hypothesis. It wouldn't stand up in Mr. Tabash's courts very well. And the reason is, it's a very complicated hypothesis. It suggests three people acting quite separately from each other, producing this effect. Whereas the hypothesis that John did the crime is a simple hypothesis because it suggests one person doing one act leads you to expect all the data. Okay, so a hypothesis is probably true insofar as if it were true, you would expect the evidence. If it was false, you wouldn't, and it's a simple hypothesis. And what goes for this simple detective case goes also in science, history, or anything else. It's true of the most complicated scientific theory, that although it's a fairly complicated scientific theory, it's nevertheless the simplest one of which it is true, that if it's true, you would expect to find the data. If it's false, you wouldn't. Okay. Now, I've sketched you the hypothesis that there is a God. This is a simple hypothesis because it postulates the existence of a person as simple as a person can be. We are limited in various ways. This being is unlimited. It's not that he has powers to move something 3,000 kilometers, 3,000 kilotons or whatever in weight. He can move anything. Likewise with his knowledge, likewise with his freedom. There are no limits. And scientists have always postulated theories with zero or infinity in them as simpler than theories with complicated numbers in them. They used to postulate that light had infinite velocity when that was compatible with the data because it was the simplest theory that was. And a God like that, one doesn't have to add any additional qualifications to him. Those three properties will entirely account for his nature and for his actions. And furthermore, if the hypothesis of theism is true, then there is no further explanation of that. Because if there were limits to God's power, then there would be something else further which would have to explain those limits, and that doesn't arise in this case. Okay. If it's true, would you expect to find the data? Well, God is perfectly good. So what's a perfectly good being going to do? Well, you might say he's going to create a best of all possible worlds. But there couldn't be a best of all possible worlds, because whatever world he makes, he could make it better. Suppose he makes a world with 1 trillion human beings in it. It would be better if he made 1,000,000,001 human beings. There is no limit. But what he can do is make a best kind of world, a world in which all the greatest kinds of goodness are exemplified. And so one kind of goodness which he will try and bring about will be the existence of free, rational, limited agents. Beings like ourselves who have a limited amount of freedom and can choose between good and evil, and have a limited amount of knowledge but can learn to grow in it, and limited powers and can learn to extend them. God can do no evil, and therefore he will want to create a kind of goodness which is its own kind of goodness, but which he can't exemplify. And we have that kind of goodness, and that is the goodness to choose between good and evil. A good God, like a good parent, will wish to delegate, will wish to create other free beings with whom he can interact lovingly, but he won't want to make them love him. You wouldn't want to have a child who you had so indoctrinated and so influenced that he had no option but to respond to you in the right way. You would want to create children who would work out for themselves what to do, make their own choices, decide the sort of world they wanted to make, and, if you were fortunate, love you for that. And that is the sort of goodness God would surely, among other kinds of goodness, wish to bring about, because the kind of goodness to choose between good and evil is something that he doesn't possess, but he would want other beings to possess in order that they might have really significant choices that make a difference to things. He wouldn't have programmed them the way they have to be, a really significant choice of the kind of beings they are to be, and therefore of whether to love him or not. And so he will wish to create free, rational beings, and he will want to make them responsible for each other. And if he's to do that, he must put them in a public world and give them bodies so that they will be able to interact with each other if they choose to do good to each other or if they choose to do harm to each other. So he will wish to make embodied human beings. Hence, if there is a God, you would expect there to be a physical universe, a universe of matter, because humans, you will have to have bodies. You will expect it to be an orderly universe, governed by simple laws of nature, which human beings can understand and manipulate. The world might so easily have been chaotic, but if it was chaotic, we couldn't make any difference to anything. If the world is orderly, we can learn how it works, and therefore we can choose whether or not to grow food by planting seeds and watering them, and then they will grow into plants we can eat. But if the world was chaotic, we couldn't have that choice, because there wouldn't be anything we could do with our bodies which would lead to the evolution of plants with producing food. Likewise, we couldn't hurt each other, because it would be no good by trying to throw a brick at you, because there being no simple laws of nature, there's no telling where the brick could go. It might come back at me instead. So it'll have to be an orderly universe which we can understand and learn to manipulate. Likewise, of course, it'll have to be a universe which is hospitable to our bodies, that is to say, one which allows our bodies to evolve in it. And of course, it is just that. Present scientific knowledge suggested it started with a Big Bang 15 billion years ago. And the Big Bang was such, and the laws of evolution such, that human bodies eventually emerged. But human bodies are no good on their own. You wouldn't like just to be a robot. The whole point of you is to have a conscious life which you can have good feelings and make choices. so you would expect a conscious life. And you would expect various other phenomena, which I may have time to talk about in due course. But if there is no God, you would not expect these phenomena. There's not the slightest reason to suppose there would be a universe at all, let alone a big universe of matter. Likewise, if there is no God, why should there be laws of nature? For what are laws of nature? The law of gravity just is the fact that every atom, everywhere, throughout endless time and space, behaves in exactly the same way. Think what the odds of winning a trillion lotteries in turn. That would be the odds of everything behaving in exactly the same way, unless it was caused by something else, e.g. God so to do. Even if there are laws of nature, there is not the slightest reason to suppose that the universe would start in such a condition and have such laws of nature as to lead to the evolution of human beings. Indeed, a lot of recent scientific work on the fine-tuning of the universe has drawn our attention to the fact that the Big Bang was of exactly the right kind. If it had been a little bit bigger, all the atoms would have flown away from each other so that they wouldn't come together to form the chemical elements which build up to human bodies. If it had been a slightly bit smaller, they'd all have collapsed on each other, so that, again, you wouldn't have got those elements. And finally, even if the physical laws produced your bodies, there's not the slightest reason in the physical laws themselves to suppose they would give rise to a conscious life. This is just matter in electrochemical interaction. There is no reason why it should give rise to thoughts and feelings and so on. And it's no good saying, well, doesn't the theory of evolution explain that? Theory of evolution by natural selection simply explains why certain things that are thrown up by the evolutionary process get eliminated, but it doesn't explain why they're thrown up in the first place. And various truths about biochemistry may explain why certain non-animate organisms are thrown up, but it can't explain why what's thrown up has feelings, thoughts, purposes, intentions, desires, let alone moral thoughts, feelings, intentions, purposes, desires. Again, all we know, sure, the body is connected to the mind, and various goings-on in the brain lead to various thoughts, and various purposes of mind lead to various goings-on in my brain. And there are many causal connections, but these are rather miscellaneous causal connections, and there's no general theory of how this can come about. And I don't think there can be a general theory, because it would have to explain such phenomena as why does this nerve firing give me the thought that there's now only 2 minutes left to speak, and that nerve firing give me the thought that 2 and 2 make 4, rather than the other way round. And it's very difficult to think of a theory which would see such connections between the different kinds of brain event and the different kinds of mental event. But even if there was such a theory, then there would have to be a whole set of psychophysical laws as well as the physical laws in order to explain this. And if there's a God, you might expect there to be such psychophysical laws, but if there isn't a God, there's not the slightest reason to suppose that you would. And finally, among all the phenomena which I've mentioned, we do have the phenomena of so many people having had religious experiences in the sense of awarenesses to them of the presence of God in their lives. You might expect that if there is a God, that you certainly wouldn't have any particular reason for expecting it if there wasn't. So I would wish to claim that the hypothesis of theism is a simple hypothesis which leads you to expect these general phenomena, which otherwise you wouldn't have the slightest reason to expect, and therefore it satisfies all the good criteria of a good scientific, historical, or whatever explanation, and therefore is very probably true. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm going to base my argument tonight that the clear evidence from our physical universe makes it much more likely than not that a supernatural, self-conscious personality, that is an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful, the standard issue God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam does not exist. My dominant theme will be the lack of evidence of the supernatural and the clear indication from the physical world that the supernatural does not exist. So therefore, God is swept away with all supernatural claims. Now, unlike many believers in God and many religionists, Dr. Swinburne apparently shares a number of beliefs in common with us atheists, as I found from his writings. He believes that if God exists, such evidence must be shown by evidence rather than just faith. He believes that the Bible is not completely infallible. He believes in Darwinian evolution. He believes that objective moral standards exist separate and apart from God, and that even God would be transgressing moral boundaries if too much suffering occurred. He believes that God does not have to necessarily exist, and he believes there is no eternal suffering in hell for wrongs committed in only a single lifetime. Part of what I will argue tonight is that these very honest admissions on the part of Dr. Swinburne prove too much, and that indeed they help bolster the atheistic argument that the supernatural, including God, does not exist. Now, if I were to tell you that 2,000 years ago here in ancient Missoula, green gremlins from the sixth dimension abducted members of the native population and imbued them with special powers, and these powers are now the guardian angels of this area, and it's because of them that so many people miraculously survived the winters in this region, you wouldn't believe me. And the reason you wouldn't believe me is I've just told you something that violate the laws of nature as we understand them and violate our empirical understanding of how the physical world operates. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The problem with all the theistic hypotheses is there is no testable or falsifiable evidence in our world that anything supernatural ever occurs. There's no reliable instances of the supernatural to add up in a verifiable way in order to compose a cumulative argument for God. 15 times 0 is still 0. Now, miracles. Claims of miracles have the initial problem of bearing witness against themselves, since by their very nature, they are violations of the very laws of nature that they are not supposed to be violated. And so all the supposed miracles that are used to verify the intervention in human affairs of God allegedly took place in a pre-scientific era. This is very suspect. Why not today? Why did the ancients get to see all the neat shock and awe stuff that we moderns are denied today? I submit it's because those things never happened, but were just the fabrications of ancient primitive minds, because if they would happen and had happened, certainly they would happen today. If God used pillars of fire and miracles and plagues to get the Jews out of Egypt, why didn't the same God do that to get the Jews out of Auschwitz? And we have to understand that these miracles don't occur today. Talking snakes, talking donkeys, worldwide floods, sun standing still, people being turned into pillars of salt. These are all childish fairy tales, and they have no veridical basis, and if they did, they would occur today. Now let's look at Jesus' resurrection. That was supposedly the most momentous thing that ever occurred. Why did it occur back in ancient primitive times rather than today? Let Jesus come back today, be re-crucified, and then on CNN, with all of our top scientists studying his body, verify he's dead, then have him come back to life. We could say, Jesus resurrects, film at 11. That would at least have some kind of veridical evidence. Or better yet, have him preach in Saudi Arabia, where the Islamic dictators there would then chop his head off, and then miraculously on worldwide TV, the head could reattach. Jesus could stand up and say, well, I guess this settles a dispute between Christianity and Islam. Now watch me rise up to heaven. That would be an evidentiary basis, but these things don't happen today as they allegedly happened back then. Why? Now, on page 223 of his book, Providence and the Argument from Evil, Dr. Swinburne says that he proceeds on the assumption that there's life after death. The problem is he has to first establish the likelihood that we survive our physical deaths in order to get to the afterlife in the first place. And I submit that there's the strongest evidence that our physical minds, that our physical brains are the basis for consciousness, and that the idea of a packet of awareness surviving the destruction of the brain is highly improbable. For instance, we know our self-awareness, we know our self-consciousness through the language we speak. Well, the language we speak only comes to us laboriously by sensory input into the physical brain. If you don't have sensory input into the physical brain, then you don't have the capacity to acquire consciousness in the first place. So if a 3-month-old child dies without having learned language, without having developed self-identity, does that child pop out into the afterlife the same if any of us would die, a fully formed person speaking a language with cultivated thoughts? The very substance of our self-awareness and self-identity, the very I am that each of us is the consequence of sensory input into a physical brain. So the very development of meaningful self-consciousness cannot occur without a physical brain. So how could it possibly be said that death is just the stepping out of the body? If you take someone and you keep them all their lives for 70 years away from humans, they've never heard the sound of a human voice, you just kept them hydrated and climactically comfortable and fed them, and they die at the age of 72 or 73, is such an individual going to pop out into the hereafter the same as anyone else? Of course not, because who we are, the essence of our very self-consciousness, is dependent upon the sensory experiences that have come through the physical brain. And also, if the physical brain were not so much the basis for our consciousness, an anesthetic wouldn't wipe it out, Alzheimer's disease wouldn't efface and obliterate the brain. So therefore, the totality of who we are is what is developed through the physical brain by sensory input. Now, not only does this make implausible life after death, this also renders unlikely God's existence because we have no prior experience, and this is very important in the Bayesian confirmation methodology that Dr. Swinburne uses to make his primary inductive argument for God. We have no background information or background information in related fields of knowledge that demonstrate the possibility of a disembodied being, of a disembodied mind. And so since all of our manifestations of conscious intelligence result in only those beings that have physical brains, we don't even have any kind of model, any kind of template for ascribing intelligence, conscious awareness to something without a body and without a brain. So how can we believe in a thinking, willful God when that God doesn't have a physical brain? And how can we think that that God ponders anything if there are no cortical neurons and synapses working? So therefore, this argument not only shows the implausibility of life after death, but also shows the implausibility of a God, because that requires a fully intelligent being without a physical brain. Now, in Ephesians 1:11 and Isaiah 46:9-11, God supposedly says he can make whatever he wants to happen. So then why are there natural disasters, holocausts? And if suffering is a warning from God, or these evils, God should explain. Otherwise, God is being too hidden. For instance, if your 3-year-old was killed last night because of your inside stock trading deals, let God explain that. Why is one child born in a Bangladesh mud hut and the other in a mansion in Beverly Hills? I can tell you there was no benefit to my mother's experiences in Auschwitz. She did not emerged with a better character. She didn't emerge stronger. She didn't emerge no resolute. There was absolutely no benefit to her having undergone that experience. Why wasn't God there to experience her and comfort her if there was some greater reason for her having to be there? And so the burden of proof is on the theist, which I think even Dr. Swinburne accepts in terms of burdens of proof, to show that evil is not fatal to an all-good and all-powerful God. Now, God does not adequately comfort us in suffering. If you had a child and that child were suffering from leukemia and you would have to have that child undergo very, very painful treatments in a hospital, you would at least let your son or daughter know that you love him or her, that you want them to get better, and that you're there to comfort them. But God doesn't even do that to the teeming masses of suffering. And if God would give concrete manifestation of his existence, that would help. That would, and I mean concrete manifestation of his existence, not just vague religious beliefs, that would help the suffering know that he's there, even if they had to undergo it. Also, there is the problem with pleasure and pain. If God existed, why would there be unnecessary pleasure and unnecessary pain? For instance, on a naturalistic world, we would expect that since there's no one minding the store, we would have pain needlessly. But let's say that, for instance, pain exists in order to stop us from destroying ourselves, in order to stop us from doing something wrong. And so it would be understandable on theism if, for instance, we stuck our hand in the fire, it would hurt because God wouldn't want our hand to burn up. Or, for instance, if we run out into the cold completely unclad, that we would feel an uncomfortable freezing sensation because God would want us to survive and want the human race to survive. But the thing is there is no purpose to gratuitous pain. There's no purpose for someone trapped in a building that they can't escape anyway to feel the horrible pangs of agony when they're being burnt to death. So if we look at the existence of pain, the existence of unnecessary pain, pain that has no molding or character building benefits, pain which comes about when there's no use for it, when it's not going to help someone improve their lives, that kind of pain you would expect if there is no one there that's conducting the affairs of the universe. And so the existence of gratuitous, unnecessary pain, or pain that doesn't become involved in molding character or improving us, you would expect that if there is no God. Now, though many theists, including Dr. Swinburne, believe in Darwinian evolution, I would say that its presence actually, though it can be compatible with some kind of God, on balance indicates that there is no God in the universe, because it's sloppy. Why would God need to have a situation where 99% of all species that ever existed are now extinct? And there's nothing which provides the motives for this God. If it's suggested that God wanted to there be intelligent life, why did God have to take billions and billions of years for it to emerge, and then billions more for life to develop intelligence? And why all of this trial and error and this groping? Evolution shows itself to be more like some trial and error process than what an all-powerful God would do. So an all-powerful God sits back and sets into motion something that for eons and eons runs into brick walls until by trial and error it gets it right. You know, this is not something which you would expect if there's an all-powerful, all-good God that desires the development of intelligent life. And so none of the trial and error aspects of evolution appear rational from a human perspective. Also, we know that evolution is true by empirical scientific study. For instance, there is a 100% DNA match between sequences in the pseudogene region of the beta globin between humans and gorillas. So if we see that evolution is much more likely than not true, then we have to ask ourselves, what is the problem with this God and having to use this trial and error system over billions and billions of years? Why not a more direct process of accomplishing his objectives, which this all-powerful God would be capable of doing? Now, one of the greatest reasons that I think the natural universe yields up no possibility, likelihood of God is divine hiddenness. Why does God allow such reasonable non-belief? Now, Dr. Swinburne and others have made arguments about epistemic distance, that God wants us to have free will. But you see, my free will is better exercised if I have all the facts. God is not there to comfort many dying people. When soldiers at war face imminent demise, God doesn't appear to them miraculously. There's no actual veridical manifestation on the battlefield of a God that says, okay, you're about to die, but guess what? It's going to be all right because I'm going to take you to heaven. And again, bear in mind the arguments I made about the implausibility of life after death. So why is God so inaccessible that only the ancients once again got to see these great miracles, but we are denied them today? Also, why so many different religions? In the Jewish community in which I grew up, we used to have a saying, when you have 2 Jews, you'll have 100 opinions. And you have all of these situations of people searching for and finding different answers or finding no answers. Now, for instance, if after all my years as a seeker, there would be a booming voice from heaven telling me to get to a church or to a synagogue right away or I'm burned toast, that would be something that is much more understandable. Or if this podium turned into green mist, or if Dr. Swinburne and I were transported to a beach in Hawaii right now. But the thing is, in the absence of that, not only are the ironclad predictable laws of nature, not only do they betray no actual evidence of the supernatural, there's every reason to believe that all God concepts are fabricated by people and don't possess independent truthfulness and objective morality, and the evidence of our world strongly suggests that we are alone in a vast and indifferent universe, and God is not sufficiently evident. So why did God give us such a hard to believe Bible? For instance, look, in the first chapter of Genesis, the stars are created after the earth. Well, we know that the earth came into existence at least 7 billion years after the universe came into existence, and many stars obviously preceded the earth's existence. What about the talking snake in Genesis? Also, Genesis says that had the plants come about before the sun. Well, that's not possible at all. And we know the age of the earth from looking at all sorts of scientific data, which shows that it's billions of years old, not the few thousand years old. And in Genesis, the stars are fixed to a firmament, which is heaven, and modern cosmology says that's different. So why all this confusion? For instance, many Christians disagree on many items of belief. Now, for instance, Dr. Swinburne has written that there has to be a certain amount of epistemic distance and maybe even confusion in the Bible. But the thing is that when there are such rank contradictions, it makes it too hard to believe. Why does God set up such roadblocks if God wants us to have a fighting chance to believe? For instance, the Bible is absolutely contradictory on salvation. In parts of the New Testament, it says that mere faith in Jesus is sufficient for salvation. In other parts, it says no, good deeds are absolutely prerequisite also for salvation. Now, contrary to many Christians, if you read 257 and page 258 of Dr. Swinburne's Providence and the Problem of Evil, he says that people that develop good character may very well have a chance to come to believe in God after they die, even if they don't do it before. That's clear in what he writes in those 2 pages. Well, a lot of Christians would believe in him, would disbelieve in that. A lot of Christians say, well, if you don't make it before you die, you spend eternity in the barbecue room. Why does God allow such differences on such crucial questions? And then, of course, look at some of the improbable things in the New Testament. Jesus, supposedly divine being, referring to Gentiles as dogs. And then there was the problem with that childish temper tantrum with the fig tree. So we have so many reasons to doubt the quality of this revelation. There are so many not only contradictory but supernatural and implausible things that occur there that we have to ask ourselves, why isn't this a much more reliable revelation? Why is it so defective that many honest and sincere seekers, myself included, had to conclude that there was no basis for it? And also religious experience, that's very vague. That's not veridical or evidential. God doesn't appear to people directly. Dr. Swinburne writes in Is There a God? That sometimes you can have a vague feeling or look at the night sky. That doesn't prove anything. That's not something which is impossible on atheism. And in fact, if people claim to hear divine audible voices, we have places where we put such people, particularly if they act on those things that they hear. So therefore, religious experience is something so subjective, and not only that, religious experience differs so widely from people to people. A Christian might pray and get the notion that the only thing you can do is pray to Jesus, but the Dalai Lama will meditate for 10 hours a day and come back and say, hey, guess what? They're just some cosmic soup. Why doesn't God give clear evidence? So therefore, if you look at the totality of the physical universe and the day-to-day experiences we have, and the fact that all of these claims of miracles took place so long ago, the best answer is we live in a naturalistic universe. There is no supernatural. There is no God. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Tabash has made 101 different points, and it would take me quite a long time to answer them all. But I have 10 minutes, and therefore I must choose what I think would help you most. And I rather suspect you'd like me to say a little bit both about the problem of evil and about divine hiddenness. Why is there pain and suffering? Well, remember I said that the point of God creating human beings is to give them freedom and give them responsibility. Now, if the only good things in the world were kicks of pleasure and the only bad things stabs of pain, then indeed there would be a problem about evil, an insoluble problem, because God could remove the stabs of pain and just give us the kicks of pleasure. But the goods for humans are rather greater than stabs of pleasure. Pleasure is a good thing, but it's even better to be able to cause pleasure to somebody else. It's even better still to have the choice of whether to cause pleasure or pain to someone else. You may not think that at first, but it's a good thing to be responsible for other people. One of the most awesome responsibilities that so many of us have or will have is the responsibility of parenthood. And very simple and very ordinary people have this enormous responsibility. And that is their blessing, that they have this responsibility. They're very fortunate to have this responsibility. And it wouldn't be a real responsibility if God had rigged it so that he allowed them to decide whether to give the baby this sort of milk or that sort of milk, but not for the whole baby's future to depend on them. God gives us enormous responsibilities. You might think too much, but it's an enormous blessing to have responsibilities. It's an enormous blessing to be the vehicle of good. It's an enormous blessing to have a choice of whether to do good or evil, and a continuing choice in responsibility for others. It's an enormous blessing to be of use to others, whether or not you choose to be of use to others. Let me take an example which doesn't always appeal to this generation in the Western world, but has seemed evident to very many generations. It was an enormous blessing for somebody to fight for their country and die in a just war. A just war for the defense of their country, which was ultimately successful. Even if they were a conscript, even if they were called up, so long as they didn't run away, they were fortunate to be able to give their lives for a worthy, enormously worthy cause for other people. And so the blessings that God wants to give us are big blessings, and that's not just kicks of pleasure, but it's helping people, being responsible for good or evil for people, and being of use to people. And if he's to do that, there's going to be quite a lot of suffering. Quite a lot, but a limited amount. It may not seem limited, perhaps, but it is limited, of course. Limited to, in the case of any individual. I hope you don't think I'm treating this callously, but in order to examine the issues rather carefully and logically, I have to state what is the situation. It's limited to about 80 years. That is to say, in the scale of eternity, it is hard for some people, but nevertheless it is limited. And God gives us this enormous responsibility. And you may say, well, fortunate for me to be able to look after my offspring, less fortunate for my offspring to be entrusted to me. And of course, in a way, that is true. But notice also that my offspring, by their vulnerability to me, make it possible for me to have the great choices that I do. And the great choices that I do make a difference to the character which I have. So I can't merely choose, I don't merely choose to do good or evil to you, because each time we do a good act, we make it easier to do a good act next time. And each time we do a bad act, we make it easier to do a bad act next time. We form our character. And other people who are, for a little while, at our mercy, are the vehicle of helping us to do that. Now, that is why God allows, for limited periods, us to suffer. But our suffering is never in vain. It is a suffering which makes possible a good for other people. And that is the case whether it is suffering at their hands or whether it is suffering at inanimate hands, that is, through disease or accident. All of these things give us choices of how to react to them. Mr. Tabash mentioned that his mother was in Auschwitz, and it did her character wasn't improved by that. I'm sorry even to have to mention Auschwitz, which is a terrible thing, but you're naturally worried about it. I'm worried about it, and since he raised it, I'll mention it. Auschwitz was brought about by innumerable choices over a number of centuries of how people should treat the Jews, until gradually it built up into people making all the decisions which led to the final solution. God gave all these people choices, and so many of them took the wrong choices. It was his generosity and freedom, giving us freedom, that allowed for that possibility. And the people who went to Auschwitz were themselves not without choices. They did have a choice of how to react to this situation, and some of them were made heroes by it. And God is not interested just in the sufferers in Auschwitz. He was interested in the concentration camp guards, and they too had choices. And they had a choice of whether at the last moment to stop this happening, and so many of them didn't. If that was the end of the story, of course, I would have a problem. But I have to defend Christianity as a whole, and that isn't the end of the story, according to Christianity. There is life after death, and if we make good choices and cope with difficult situations, God will give us more opportunities and more hope after to make ourselves the sort of people who will be suited for him in the afterlife. Now, all this isn't evident to Mr. Tabash. He says there's a problem of God's hiddenness. Well, God is partially hidden. That is quite true. To some people, his presence is rather more evident than to others. Why does God allow some people to be ignorant of his presence? Well, just think of what would be the situation if we were all totally aware of the presence of God, what he wanted us to do, and had no doubts about this. Our situation would be like the situation of the child in the nursery who knows that his mother is looking in all the time. The child wants to please his mother, rightly so. He wants to be liked by good mothers. And he doesn't want to be punished. So of course he won't hit his brother. It's not an option. But it only becomes an option when he's rather doubtful whether his mother is looking in at the nursery, and whether it's doubtful whether his mother will punish him even if she knows about it. God has to stand back in order for not to make it so obvious to us that the all-good source of our being sees what we do, because otherwise we won't have a serious choice of the character to form. And, of course, other people will be deprived of the opportunity of helping us to form that good character, because one of the great blessings that God gives us is to help other people to know about him, help other people to be good. And if God's presence and wishes are present all the time, we don't have that opportunity. All the time, God has made us interdependent people, and that costs something. But just think of the cost of not having it. We'd be shut up in little boxes so that we couldn't make any difference to each other, and that wouldn't be a good world. God has given us the responsibility for each other. There's a price to pay for it, but it's tremendously worthwhile to be of use, even if by choosing how to react to suffering, and to be able to help other people in difficult and in very difficult circumstances. And so it's worth it.
If you are the father of two rambunctious boys and you're playing with them in the park and there's a sheer cliff and you see one about to push the other over the cliff, you would intervene. You wouldn't say, no, the free will of my one son to either kill his brother trumps the tragedy of my losing one of my sons, so I'm going to stand by and allow this to play out. So if we're drawing any kind of analogy between the cosmic parent and the human parent, this absolutely breaks down. Now, on page 103 of Is There a God?, Dr. Swinburne actually argues that if someone does a horrible wrong to you, you are fortunate because you gave them the scenario in which to play out their free will. I have misgivings about that. That would mean that the little girl in South Central Los Angeles who was maimed by a stray gang bullet was lucky because she gave the gang member the choice as to whether or not to shoot off his AK-47 in a residential neighborhood. He would have still had that choice. He could have still shot off his AK-47 even if it didn't hit anybody. And I can't imagine saying to that little girl as she suffers in agony in the hospital and in the aftermath of attempting to recover, you don't know how lucky you were because you were a prop on the stage of this gang member being able to do an exercise of free will for good or bad. I don't think that would comfort us. And once again, the hidden God has an obligation to reveal himself and to show that if that's what's happening. Now, you see, there is a tension in what Dr. Swinburne is saying. On the one hand, he talks about and writes about the importance of revelation and the importance of believing revelation. On the other hand, he talks about God being hidden so we still have free will. But the way he ultimately poses it, it's on a collision course with itself. His arguments actually clash against each other because as much hiddenness as there is casts in doubt the ability to accept the revelation. When I was 20 years old, I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to try everything. So I took the Bible, I sat down with it, and I said, Jesus, if you're really there, if both the atheists are wrong and the Orthodox rabbis I've grown up are wrong, and the New Age gurus are wrong, and Christianity is the answer, come into my heart. I got this immediate sense of revulsion saying, what, are you crazy? How could this be true? How could a religion that sends people to hell or whatever after death, how could such a religion be true? And how could you be judged on your belief system even if you're a good person? Why should that even matter? And what about the whole concept of God being his own father, his being his own son, and the resurrection only occurred once in ancient history? And I felt a sense of revulsion. Well, I was a sincere seeker after truth on my way to my atheism and tried every kind of spiritual path that's available in Southern California, of which there are many. And of course, you know, I came kicking and screaming into atheism of intellectual necessity. Well, God was too hidden for me and too hidden for many other people that I know. So you see, Dr. Swinburne can't have it both ways. If revelation is supposed to be an evidentiary and reliable something for us to latch onto, then God shouldn't have so much of a counterweight by being so hidden and giving so much contrary evidence to the supernatural that we have no choice, many of us, but to ultimately reject the revelation. Now, Dr. Swinburne says that he has to defend Christianity and talk about the ultimate life after death, but the thing is, he didn't respond to my arguments of why life after death is plausible. He didn't respond to or explain to us the mechanism by which our conscious awareness, which was totally dependent for its development on the input into the brain through the sensory channels, all of a sudden now becomes independent of the brain and can fly off into some astral hereafter without any kind of physical brain. He didn't even explain the mechanism by which the seeming total dependence of conscious awareness on the physical brain is overcome at death. How is the mechanism of that? Now, he says that it is a blessing to die in a just war for your country. But that does not answer whether it was a blessing for instance, the woman killed off the coast at San Luis Obispo when she was swimming, a 50-year-old woman, and a great white shark got her. What was the blessing? Was she fortunate because she was able to give the great white shark the free will of deciding whether to chomp into her or not? Or let's take the little girl in South Central Los Angeles who was shot, and this time let's take another instance of little boy who was killed. Was he fortunate in the same way as the soldier because he died for the cause of giving the gang member the choice of shooting into his home? You see, all these things remain unanswered. And if you use the analogy, of the cosmic parent to the human parent in a way that Dr. Swinburne suggests, no human parent would ever allow such recklessness on the part of the children. There is a point at which, even given a rational scope of free will, the parent would intervene before horrible death or horrible injury occurs. So again, Dr. Swinburne's analogies are in collision with themselves. Also, in his ultimate meta point, that the universe itself, that the natural workable predictability of natural laws require an underlying supernatural, this is really animism. This is like imbuing the thunder and the lightning with angry gods. Where does he show us how an incorporeal being, a disembodied mind, can in the first place think without a physical brain, and in the second place, what is the mechanism and the process by which an incorporeal mind that had to be outside time and space at a certain point, because time and space came into being with the Big Bang, affected time and space. How something without corporeal body is able, how something supernatural brings about the natural. He wasn't able to demonstrate the mechanism by which that occurs, so that's mere supernatural speculation. See, in his own Bayesian confirmation theory, he has to have background information in which he takes into account all the available evidence, and he doesn't take into account all the evidence for naturalism and doesn't respond to the problem of how it is that in only this one instance the supernatural affected the natural. We have a right to know in scientific terms how God accomplished such a task. Dr. Swinburne didn't give us that explanation. And so certainly if God wanted to teach either the people in Auschwitz a lesson, or God wanted to teach the Gestapo guards a lesson, he could have had less horrible ways. You can put somebody through boot camp or Navy SEAL training and improve their character, and that is not as horrible and unbearable an experience as a concentration camp. You can put people through rigorous training. You can give them obstacles and challenges that are truly character molding without imposing the kind of horrible suffering that we have to undergo in our universe. So all of these things remain critically unexplained. And also, again, from the standpoint of divine hiddenness, if God wants to give many of us a fighting chance to believe in him, he needs to explain that hiddenness. Also, Dr. Swinburne did not address the point I brought up about miracles. And I think this is very important, because if they are indeed violations of the laws of nature, we need somehow a basis for being able to concretely believe in them. Once again, let me restate my point in my opening statement, that if God used all these miraculous events 3,000 years ago to get the Jews out of Egypt, why didn't he at least do some of these to get the Jews out of Auschwitz? Why didn't a modern-day Moses do miracles to Hitler? Why didn't the Rhine River open and swallow the Nazi soldiers? Why wasn't there a pillar of fire leading the Jews out of Dachau and Treblinka and Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen? So this is all powerful evidence that all of these miracles were just fabrications by primitive people in primitive times and never occurred, or they would occur today. And this is, again, additional evidence. We live in a natural universe, no supernatural, no God. Thank you.
Mr. Tabesh knows very well that the reasons why I didn't answer all these various points were simply the 10-minute constraint, and I thought it wise to give her whole 10 minutes to the problem of evil. But he presses me on a number of matters, and I'll take up first questions connected with mind and body. In his opening remarks, he says there is no evidence of the supernatural. My opening remarks were designed to show just that the supernatural, the supposition of a God of this character, is such as to lead you to expect the evidence which you wouldn't otherwise expect, and is a simple hypothesis. He makes the point that we've no other reason to suppose that there are beings like this. That is irrelevant if we are seeking to explain the whole universe. When a physicist or a chemist tries to explain why this substance combines with that substance, he does so in terms of atoms and molecules, and the physicist explains these in terms of quarks. And it's no good some critic coming along and saying, this is ridiculous to suppose there could be particles which were only 10 to the minus 13 centimeters in length. We've never seen one. That would be absurd. The point is, in order to explain the data, we postulate things unlike those which we have seen, which are such as to lead you to expect what we have seen. And the hypothesis of theism is of just that character. Now, he is also concerned, Mr. Tabash, with how could we survive death if we are entirely dependent on our brains. Well, firstly, we're not entirely dependent on our brains. That's to say it's a two-way process. You stick a needle in me and I'll feel pain. You tell me things and I'll hold beliefs. But it goes the other way too. I make a decision to move my arm, I move my arm. I work out certain things of a very complicated character. This leads to the actions which I do. It's a two-way process. Our brains are partly dependent on us. And not merely that, but this conscious life, the life of thought and feeling and purpose, isn't just a brain property. It's a property of a separate substance, the soul, which is in interaction with the body. Now, my reasons for saying that are many, but I can demonstrate it pretty quickly by a well-known thought experiment. Suppose a mad surgeon gets hold of me and takes my brain out of my body and divides it into two. And he puts one half of this brain into that lady's skull from which her existing brain has been removed, and the other half brain into that gentleman's skull from which his brain has been removed. And then suppose that there aren't enough bits in order to start up a living person, so you get a few more bits from my identical twin. So you put them in there, and you put them in there, and you then have two living persons of conscious lives. Now, which would be me? Well, they'd both behave like me, and they both say they were me. But they couldn't both be me, because if that's the same as this and that's the same as this, then that's the same as that. But they're not. They go out, they have different experiences thereafter. So there are three possibilities. That one's me and that one isn't. That one is me and that one isn't, or neither. Now, the point of this, my making this point to you, this thought experiment, is this. You can know everything about my brain. You can know everything about those brains. You can know what thoughts and feelings that person has, and that person has, and this person has. But the one thing you wouldn't know is who that person is, whether it's me, or who that person is, whether that's me. Yet a person is a thing. It's a thing that has properties. So you could know all about the physical things, brains, all about the properties, the conscious lives connected with them, without knowing who they were. And that suggests that being me isn't just having certain conscious experiences connected to a brain, it's being a thing connected to a brain. Because if it wasn't that, if I didn't consist of a soul, an immaterial soul, then if you knew everything that had happened to the physical, to my brain, and knew all the thoughts and feelings that were going on, and if being me was just physical and having thoughts and feelings, you'd know which person was me. But you wouldn't know which person was me, and that's because being me isn't just a matter of continuity of brain matter, it's a matter of something else, continuity of soul. So from our very study of what happens in this world, we can learn that being a person is being a soul connected to the body, and the soul makes a difference to the body. And therefore, when death comes, they are separated. But there is something there when they are separated and the body is thrown in the crematorium. There is a soul. And it is in the power of an omnipotent being to do what he will with that soul. But that soul is the sort of thing that has purposes and thoughts. And if God chooses to let it go on and to give it a fuller life, he can do so, because that's what we are. So, no problem there. Now, just another one or two more problems that has been raised. Darwinism. Mr. Tabesh says it's rather wasteful of God to spend 14 billion years or so before he produced you and me. Well, it would be if you and me was the only aim of creation. But there's an awful lot of good things around besides you and me. The animals, to start with. Animals, tremendously good thing, and they do good. They look after their young, though they don't choose whether to do so. They are good things, and it's a great, all that's happened in evolution, so much of it has been good. And again, where there has been evil, it has itself been of purposeful evil. It has served a good to those animals, because if an animal suffers, it can react, although not freely. It can react in right ways, and it can help other animals. And again, the inanimate world is a wonderful thing. Before ever there were even plants and animals, there was the whirling galaxies, and they're a good thing on their own. God doesn't have to produce us by that way, but it's very good that he does so, because those are very good things in themselves. So, again, no waste. There would only be a waste if God was a limited being who had to choose between ways of producing us. Yes, you could have less evil by having boot camps, but you would have less good. It's serious choices God wants to give us, and he can only give us serious choices if he makes serious evils as possibilities for us. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Swinburne says that it is the supposition that there's a supernatural which leads us to it. But you see, that's question-begging, because we look around the physical universe and we don't see evidence of it. So if he's going to claim that there was some meta-entity that jump-started the universe, he has to show us the mechanism by which that occurs. Now, he made a reference to quarks and neutrinos, subatomic particles. They were empirically verified in 1968 by scientific experiment. And the thing is that their postulation didn't create a whole new category of beings. We already knew there were subatomic particles. It's just that we now found some new subatomic particles. But we don't know that there are supernatural beings, and God is just one more. So this is creating a whole new category of the type of thing which we never saw before. And again, using the background information required by his own employment of the Bayesian confirmation theory, we don't have any type of background or related field of endeavor in which to show that supernatural beings or disembodied minds are possible. Now, as far as trying to show that the physical consciousness is not dependent on the brain and therefore survives death, he hasn't overcome my argument about how everything we know and acquire about ourselves is through sensory input into the brain, and also why Alzheimer's disease or an anesthetic can so totally eclipse consciousness. He talks about the interaction between body and mind. The fact remains is that if our brains are destroyed, our consciousness is eclipsed. So whatever the consciousness does while the brain exists is just a byproduct of an existing brain. Now, if we take his consciousness experiment And let's follow this through. If we transplant Dr. Swinburne's brain into one other or two other people, the consciousness follows the brain. And that still shows that conscious awareness is contingent on the brain. Now, a problem with his analogy is we don't know what happens if we split the brain, if there'll be any consciousness. We don't know that without the corpus callosum integrating the left and right hemispheres, whether indeed that half a brain would contain anything. But you see, in order for Dr. Swinburne to be able to make his point, what needs to happen is that we would have to transfer his brain into somebody else's body, and his body still contain his consciousness, even without the brain. Then I would be impressed. But the thing is, until that occurs, we have no basis for arguing, even with his hypothetical, that the consciousness is anything more than a byproduct, an epiphenomenon of the physical brain. And so he still hasn't shown how it is that the consciousness can survive without the physical brain, particularly when we know that conscious awareness only develops by sensory input into the brain. If we are going to look at evolution, yes, there were many species that came along, and many animals are good, but if animals are good, why did this all-good, all-knowing God of Dr. Swinburne's establish such a horrible hierarchy of survival of the fittest in nature? I mean, you look at how most animals survive. They survive by eating and destroying other animals. And if that's the case, how is the antelope benefited by being eaten by the lion? While being devoured, does the antelope say, God, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be a prop on the stage of this lion's deciding whether or not to exercise free will and eating me, as opposed to the other antelope? You see, there is no discernible purpose to the gratuitous evil that animals suffer. So therefore, if these higher order animals have some kind of value and an intrinsic goodness, then why did God put them in a literal dog-eat-dog system, whereby the very survival of these creatures are dependent upon their devouring others, and in turn they're being devoured by others? That's a very, very serious problem. And if in fact we are the top product in God's assembly line, if the human animal is the best in God's department store catalog of beings, then why did God wait so long to bring us about? God could have had all these wonderful, wonderful animals and at the same time brought us about earlier. See, there's no reason for this. And also, again, we have the situation of gratuitous suffering of animals. Very good higher order animals having to ultimately be nothing but in the food chain for other animals. And also, if all these animals were so wonderful, how come 99% of all species that have existed on this earth are now extinct? And what about the languishing and flourishing of sentient beings? So many wonderful beings. My two adorable dogs, my parents, your parents, all of you. There are so many of us who spend much more of our lives languishing than flourishing. And, and then we just die. So many sentient beings undergo such a horrible existence where the balance of their suffering so much outweighs whatever joy or comfort or satisfaction they have in life. So the languishing and flourishing of sentient beings, too, is contrary to a God who deems all the animals, including us, to be so very wonderful. And also, again, God could have produced us very, very early on. Now, again, getting back to the cosmological question, to say that God caused the Big Bang is problematic. Now, we don't have all the answers as to the constituent elements of the Big Bang, but you see, it's commonly understood now that time and space came into effect with the Big Bang, so we can't even speak about cause and effect in normal terms, because cause and effect are something which derive from sequential time and space, and that's not something which occurred. We didn't have sequential time and space. So you see, if indeed there is this meta causal agency. And Dr. Swinburne says we have to answer the meta question, the ultimate question of why, then that would be a black hole that would also swallow up God, because we'd have to ask why a God? Why a disembodied being? What is the internal nature of God? Why did God wait around for an entire eternity before starting the universe? Why did God wait until only 15 billion years ago if God has existed from ever in the past up until the time of the Big Bang? What was God doing? Just twiddling his cosmic thumbs, saying, okay, let some more time pass, let some more time pass, okay, then finally let there be light so someday Dr. Swinburne and Eddie Tabash can debate my existence. You know, you have to, if you're going to say why, the whys also apply to God and are equally unanswerable, particularly when you're dealing with a disembodied being, when we have no other evidence of disembodied intelligence. So therefore, the weight of the evidence in our empirical existence in the universe and on planet Earth is that we live in a naturalistic world, no supernatural, no God. This is the fun part.
I'd much rather answer Mr. Tabesh's questions than ask him any, but the schedule means that I must ask him some, so I must press him on the initial points I made with a positive case. I think the way I'd like to ask, Mr. Tabesh rightly pointed out that you might be tempted to ask why God. Now, clearly you can explain A by B, B by C, and C by D, but in the end you've got to stop somewhere. The point is to stop at the right place, and the right place is the simplest place. And that's what's going to explain, I suggest, other things. So let me now put to Mr. Tabesh the question. Let's leave the Big Bang itself aside for the moment. Has he any answer to the question why the universe is orderly? Why the universe is governed by laws of nature? What does he think laws of nature are? I suggest laws of nature are simply the way things behave. Say there is a law of gravity is to say that each thing attracts each other thing with certain forces. In that case, my question to him is, why does everything in the universe behave in exactly the same way? If there is a God, one could explain why, and a God is a simple stopping point. But if there isn't a God, if matter is the end, why is this extraordinary coincidence?
Well, I would say to Dr. Swinburne that, of course, in many of your books, you talk about God being the ultimate brute fact. So, to be perfectly honest, you have a brute fact, which is a supernatural being, and I have a brute fact, which is natural causes of which we don't yet know all of them. Now, you might claim to know all of yours, but you're just speculating by fabricating a supernatural being. So what I want to do is I want to see if I can turn your own argument of simplicity against you, and my response is that if simplicity rules the day in hypotheses, as you've written so eloquently on over the years, then we atheists actually trump you theists because we have the simpler explanation. You see, we postulate just a universe, a physical universe with natural laws. You postulate the same thing, but you have an additional entity. So we have the more simpler explanation because our entity is the least, we just have one entity and you postulate two. And so we just have to someday explain how natural laws came into effect, and that's not so remarkable because we are here, so they obviously came about. I drop my pencil on this table and it falls. That doesn't mean that gravity is conscious, nor that its predecessor or point of origin had to be conscious. But what you have to explain is a much tougher obligation. Not only do you have to explain natural laws, you have to explain how a disembodied, incorporeal being without physical brain, how such a being brought about these. And to say, well, God just did it by snapping his fingers is really no answer. So, you see, all you do is to hide behind an ultimate supernatural, magical brute fact, while we try to rely on struggling to determine a naturalistic one. So I think on a balance of improbabilities, your supernatural additional being is less simple than my pure atheism.
But the whole point of postulating an extra entity, which is a simple thing to do, is to explain many things which follow from one thing. And I don't think Mr. Tabash has quite taken that point. Just as if all the coins in a room have the same markings, you don't say it's simpler just to suppose that they all have the same markings. You think it's simpler to suppose they all have the same markings because they have the same cause. Having made that, which is not, of course, part of a question, I can go on to the next question, which is, even suppose that Mr. Tabash were to have provided an explanation of why there are laws of nature, how about an explanation of why those laws are such as to produce human beings? Because there could be innumerable different laws of nature and innumerable different starting points. And he did just suggest an answer in one remark he made in his last remarks that, well, this isn't surprising because we're here. Does he really think that the explanation of there being the Big Bang and laws of nature such as to produce us is explained by our being here? May I ask him, wouldn't he think that was rather like an explanation of why he came of saying that the explanation of why his grandparents met each other was that he later came to exist? That would hardly be the right way round of doing it.
We see, the problem with the way the question is posed is that Dr. Swinburne is saying that I have to give a full accounting of all the reasons why naturalistic laws exist, and if I can't, I have to leap into his magical explanation for which he has no direct evidence and for which he has no explanation of the mechanism by which it happened. It is not scientific to say we can't understand this yet, so we're going to say God did it. That is the ultimate God of the gaps argument. It is scientific to say we don't have all the answers yet, so we're going to look for it. But you see, what he's doing is he's saying that anyone who can't yet give all the answers has to leap into the magical God. And I'm saying anyone who doesn't yet have all the answers has to look further into science. Now, I think that an uncaused universe is still something more sensible than is a divine magical being. Now, we know from certain areas of quantum electrodynamics, there are subatomic particles that apparently appear without any reason, without any actual physical cause. And when you take the further understanding that time and space didn't come about until the Big Bang, to then say that a magical being outside of time and space created time and space is even less satisfying an answer than my saying we don't know yet, but let's continue to search.
May I suggest that it's self-contradictory to say that time didn't come into existence until the Big Bang, even if it has Stephen Hawking's approval. If something started to exist, what that means is once upon a time it was not, and then it was. So certainly time existed before the Big Bang. Now, Mr. Tabash made a lot of the subject of miracles, and he wanted to say they only occurred why did they only occur in a pre-scientific, or were they only alleged to occur in a pre-scientific era? Now, the trouble of proving miracles, as he rightly pointed out, is that a miracle is, as traditionally defined, a violation of a law of nature. That's to say, a law of nature says how things have to behave, and then a miracle is the claim that on one occasion it didn't. So it's always going to be extremely difficult to prove that a miracle occurred, because you have to prove both that these are the laws of nature and that on a certain occasion the prior conditions were such that, given that law of nature, you wouldn't have this event, and nevertheless that event occurred. Now, it's also going to be exactly as difficult to prove that a miracle didn't occur, because you would have to know all the details about the laws of nature and all the details about what the initial conditions were. So may I ask why he thinks that miracles are less frequent in our day? The difference between our day and the pre-scientific era, I suggest to him, is surely that in our day, people are reluctant to admit miracles occur unless it can be positively proved, and in the old days, people were willing to admit miracles occur even if it couldn't be positively proved. So I suggest he's no reason to suppose that, and I ask him whether he has, that miracles don't occur today, only that he can't give positive ground of that.
We see what Dr. Swinburne is saying is that they do occur today, but people are reluctant to come forward because it's hard to believe. But you see, the answer to Dr. Swinburne's question is that if they were provable and testable, they wouldn't be hard to believe. People wouldn't refrain from coming forward today if the miracles that they claim could be provable and testable. For instance, if I can say I will project my consciousness out of this room and see what's written on the blackboard in the other room, and I come back and I'm accurate, and I've never been to that other room, well, that's something pretty evidential. So also, by the same token, the miracles that supposedly occurred in biblical times were viewed by mass people, mass numbers of people. All the Jews leaving Egypt supposedly saw the pillar of fire. All those same people saw the Red Sea part and then swallow up the Egyptian soldiers. Supposedly, a lot of people saw the sun stand still. Supposedly, a lot of people saw all these other things, the ascension into heaven. Supposedly 500 saints and other great people rose out of their graves when Jesus is resurrected in order to walk around in a celebratory fashion. All these things happened in front of large numbers of people. And so the answer is that the way we suspect that the miracles today, that miracles don't happen and that their claims back then were fraudulent is the one, they don't happen on a large scale. And even if they happened on a minor scale, they don't happen in a way which is veridical and verifiable.
I think I'd like to press you on that because I don't think you've quite got my point. Of course, all ancient peoples claim to have seen those things, but they would only be miracles. The parting of the Red Sea would only be a miracle on this definition if there was no wind blowing from the east and so on, if there were no natural explanations of this. And we don't know that, but the Bible writers saw God's hand at work, rightly or wrongly, and therefore saw this as a miracle. Now, if exactly the same thing happened today, people would not think it a miracle, but the evidence before them would be exactly the same. That is to say that a rather extraordinary event happened, which was they suspected such that the laws of nature would not allow it to occur, but they didn't know enough about the initial conditions. They were therefore assuming that this was in those days, that they were assuming that the initial conditions were such as not to produce this effect. If we saw it today, we would assume that the initial conditions were such as to produce this effect. But there's no difference in the situation, only the difference in the modern mind demanding a very strict proof of a miracle, which is very difficult to give because of the situation. You have to prove all the details of the initial condition and all the details of the laws of nature. People were much more ready then, rightly or wrongly, to accept that situation. And therefore a lot of events have happened in our day which may well be miracles, such as the calm at Dunkirk, which enabled the British fleet to get all the soldiers back from France and so to continue fighting the war. That would have been described as a miracle in those days. And it may be it's a miracle, and it may be that lots of people getting better from cancer are miracles. But we have only the grounds for supposing that they do, insofar as we have reason to suppose there's a God. And I've given some reason for supposing there is a God, and therefore that sort of event is rightly interpreted in that way.
We see, I think what Dr. Swinburne has just done is he's given great reasons to reject both biblical miracles and modern-day miracles, because he's showing the suspect nature of all supernatural claims, but yet he can't really get away with that with respect to his Bible, because his Bible claims things which have no other interpretation other than miracles. Jesus' resurrection, if somebody really resurrected from the dead and floated up to heaven, we wouldn't say, well, okay, that's explainable in other terms. And in terms of parting of the Red Sea, in terms of all the plagues plagues visited on the Egyptians, if all of a sudden an enemy nation's all their firstborn were the only ones to start dying and no one else, we would obviously say, hey, something very special is going on here, and that would be more evidentiary of a violation of the laws of nature than the British fleet encountering greater luck. And also the pillar of fire leading the Israelites out of Egypt when there was no similar pillar of fire for Auschwitz and other tragedies. Dr. Swinburne is trying to make verification of miracles so murky that I wouldn't be able to have a clear way of describing them. I can't let him get away with that because, for instance, if each and every one of you in this audience right now levitated to the ceiling, then I would have to admit that something miraculous occurred. And if all of a sudden Dr. Swinburne and I were transported to a beach in Waikiki, if we were all of a sudden transported to a mountaintop neighboring this town, I'd have to admit that something miraculous occurred. If my dead father walked in this room right now and said, Eddie, what are you doing debating the Christian philosopher? Get back to your office and do your work. I would say, okay, a miracle has occurred. So you see, Dr. Swinburne cannot get away with obfuscating this. Yes, if miracles could occur, they could occur in a way in which we would all admit they are miracles, and therefore we should be able to verify them. They do not, which means there's no miracles and no God. Okay. Well, Dr. Swinburne, on page 37 of his book, Reasonable Faith, of which I'm handing you a copy, William Lane Craig, in reference to God's requirement that people believe in Christianity, says that people are required to believe even if they are given no good reason to believe and many persuasive reasons to disbelieve. Now, do you fully agree with Dr. Craig on this? And if not, could you explain where, as a fellow Christian of his, your position differs from his?
I need to read the sentence rather carefully, I'm afraid. No, I don't agree with him. Craig's suggestion is that we're guilty, sinful, if we don't believe there's a God, because if we don't believe because we don't think that there's enough evidence that there's a God. I don't agree with that at all. And it's not merely that I don't agree with Craig, but this is certainly nowadays, the unquestioned Christian position. It's the position of the Second Vatican Council, for example, that said that atheists, other religious believers, Muslims and so on, who are not through their own fault, not believers, they too can be saved. And that surely is right, and it's consonant with certainly the things that Jesus said when he said that those who do not know their master's will and do not do it for that reason shall be beaten with few stripes. He was just making the point that those who know the master's will and don't do it will be beaten with many stripes, but those who don't know it and don't do it will be beaten with few stripes. His not to be taken, the few stripes, not to be taken particularly seriously. The point was people who don't know what they ought to believe, and for that reason don't believe it, are certainly not culpable, and that is indeed the proper Christian position.
Dr. Swinburne, throughout the book, Providence and the Problem of Evil, you talk about the importance of epistemic distance between God and humans, so that free will in coming to God will be more independently exercised by each person. Yet I take you to page 72 of Revelation from Metaphor and Analogy, where you say that if there is a God who wills our eternal well-being, there's reason to expect that this God will take steps to ensure that we acquire the information as to how to attain that well-being. Now, aren't these two policies of God in conflict? Considering that non-belief is so reasonable and understandable, isn't God engaging in too much epistemic distance, and isn't he hiding the ball too severely?
I put the case, and I put the case earlier today, that a certain amount of epistemic distance is a very good thing because it enables us to make choices without God looking in at the window. And if we feel God is looking at the window all the time, the more we feel that, the more it's easier for us to take the good choice, and therefore the less our stand for the good reflects ourselves, the less we've really committed ourselves to the good. So a certain amount of hiddenness obviously is a good thing. But there are so many cases where it's a good thing to have X and a good thing to have not X. And this happens to be one of them. There are certain advantages in hiddenness. There are obviously certain disadvantages in hiddenness. It's a good thing to know God. Of course it is. It's a good thing to know the author of our being and to interact with him. So, what shall God do in this situation? Well, give us a bit of hiddenness. If we find it very difficult, help us a bit. Help us so that it's not too difficult. Give us some revelation, but not written in the sky, the sort of revelation that needs a little bit of effort to work out. And that's the sort of revelation he's given us. He's given us a Bible and a church, but differences of interpretation, yes, so we must learn to interpret the individual verse by the message of the whole. Different church teachings, that enables us to bring our own moral understanding to bear on the issues, but we're in a much better position than if we didn't have that sort of revelation, and we can make progress that way. So, advantages in one situation, advantages in the other, even greater advantages if God gives us hiddenness, a revelation, and helps some people, and gives some people the opportunity to help others in this respect.
Okay, well, following up on the Bible, on page 124 of Is There a God, you write that a religion that advocates large-scale pillage and rape for fun cannot be a true religion. Well, you've also, no one has ever heard you say that the Old Testament is now to be severed from the totality of what we call the Bible. Yet, even though the purpose was conquest and not fun, how can you, based on that statement on page 124, then justify God's ordering all the innocent children and babies to be slaughtered, as is the case in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 3, and all the rape as spoils of war that God gleefully orders and requires even in Deuteronomy 21, 10 through 14, and Numbers 31, verses 17 through 18. Isn't your God indeed ordering, or at least then commissioning, the large-scale pillage and rape that you yourself have just talked about abhorring?
Let me give you a little history of biblical interpretation. This sort of question worried the Christian church, a number of fathers of the Christian church, in its first 3 or 4 centuries. In particular, one Christian theologian, Marcion, was so concerned with this that he said Christianity ought not to contain the Old Testament, it ought only to contain St. Paul's letters and St. Luke's Gospel. This view was eventually rejected, mainly by the teaching of Irenaeus. And why Irenaeus rejected it, he said, we mustn't take all the Old Testament literally true. Some of it is metaphorical, some of it is historical, in the sense of it's a story of people trying to find out rather more about God and eventually succeeding. And after all of that had happened, the Bible was canonized, as it were. The Christian church only decided which books were to form the Bible, finally, in about the end of the 4th century. Now, it wasn't merely Irenaeus, but the 2 leading fathers of the church, Origen and Augustine, had both produced the doctrine that you should not read the Bible literally where it was in conflict with any central Christian doctrine, including central Christian doctrines about morality. And therefore, they interpreted quite a lot of the sort of passages that Mr. Tabash has mentioned as passages about the progress of the soul to God. For example, the command in the Psalm 137 to dash the children of Babylon against the stones was interpreted as the Christians should overcome their wicked inclinations. Now, that interpretation may not seem very natural to the average fundamentalist of today, but it was the sort of way of interpreting things with which the Bible, in the light of which the Bible was canonized from the 4th century onwards.
But you see, this is precisely my point. If the Bible is a trustworthy and reliable revelation, and is the highest revelation we have from the highest source in the universe, it wouldn't be fraught with all these difficulties. It wouldn't be fraught with all these ambiguities. It wouldn't contain such things. The totality of the Holy Bible wouldn't contain within it commissioning for rape and pillage as spoils of war. And I can understand how the early church fathers, desperate to try to make some kind of rationalization, would come up with these tortured efforts. But the fact is that you have written that this is the best of all possible revelations ever given to humanity. And if it is, then why do we have to go through all these hermeneutics? You also wrote on page 83 and 84 of your book on Revelation that succeeding generations have to continue to interpret the Bible, and new communities have to interpret it and decide to some extent what books are valid and what books aren't valid. And my question is that doesn't this show that the Bible is so obscure and so abstruse that you have to have succeeding generations of people trying to rescue it from some of its own language, and to interpret the clear language of the Bible away from its true meaning to avoid the barbarism which is clearly set forth? And if that's the case, is this really not a divine document, but essentially just a fallible document, a somewhat defective document that was written by ancient people and which many of you modern Christians are just trying desperately to salvage?
My point was that this wasn't an effort of modern Christians to salvage. Interpreting the Bible, and indeed much other literature, allegorically was a very, very common and normal practice in the ancient world. If we are to take the Bible seriously, we must take seriously the conditions under which it was introduced and the way of interpreting it which was then common. And if allegory isn't too familiar in the modern world and seems to Mr. Tabash to be tortured, I agree it isn't too familiar in the modern world, but either we take the Bible seriously, which means taking it in the way and subject to the conditions to which it became a Christian doctrine, or we don't. And if it's to be taken as a Christian book, we simply must do the former. And you will find these interpretations, which certainly did not seem to them, given the culture of their time, tortured. It was with this way of interpreting it that the Bible was accepted as a Christian book. So I think Mr. Tabash's problems have arisen through rather too much contact with a certain kind of Protestant who wants to think that you can interpret the Bible without any church tradition. If you do that, then of course you are in serious trouble, as you would be in serious trouble with any set of religious books. Books need a community to interpret them, and a way of understanding built into that community of what are the central doctrines. And of course there is that. The church developed its creed and its New Testament, and in the light of that, they said that the Old Testament must be understood that way. That was the only condition under which it was taken as a Christian doctrine. And this is not a modern attempt to, as it were, deal with a lost cause.
Dr. Swinburne, notwithstanding your thought experiment of having your brain transplanted into a number of people, can you explain to us what is the difference if a 3-month-old child dies not speaking any language, not having any developed self-consciousness? Who pops out into the hereafter? And if right now, let's say that some rabid individual were to be upset with my comments thus far and stand up and shoot me and I were to die, who would pop out into the hereafter? Would it be me as I am now? or would it be an accumulation of other consciousness? And how would that consciousness survive the death of the body? And would I be in the immediate realm after death the same person that I was now? And if all that I am now is nothing in terms of my self-awareness, but an accumulation of input from the sensory channels into the brain, then how does one continue to learn or to absorb or to develop consciousness when there are no senses doing input into the physical brain in the afterlife? What is the very quality of consciousness? So the question is, who of who we are today survives the process of death? And please explain the mechanism by which whichever facet of us survives accomplishes that survival.
You survive, and what my thought experiment was designed to show is that you are not just a collection of thoughts, you are something that has a collection of thoughts. And the thing that has a collection of thoughts is not the physical brain, because if you knew all about the physical brain, you wouldn't know what had happened to you. Yes, in this world, of course, our thoughts are, well, our beliefs are given us by the outside world, and by the sensations that arrive on our ears and eyes and so on. But all we know is that that is how it happens here. We don't know that it has to happen that way. Mr. Tabash moved rather quickly in some of his longer remarks from saying, we know this happens, to we know it has to happen like this. There's not the slightest reason to suppose it has to happen like this. It has to happen like this when we're connected to a body, but when we're not connected to a body, there's not the slightest reason to suppose it does have to happen like this. As for him asking the mechanism by which in the afterlife we would acquire beliefs and so on, well, I'm not God and I don't know the answer to that. But the point is, I don't know, and he doesn't know, the mechanism by which in this world the mind influences the brain. That is to say, it just does. My thoughts make a difference to my brain, which causes my arm to move. And he doesn't know the mechanism of that, and I don't know, and the cleverest scientist hasn't got a clue of what the mechanism is. And if we don't know the mechanism in this world, but it's quite obvious there is a mechanism, or at any rate there is a causal influence, I don't see any problem in supposing that in another world there is a different mechanism, or at any rate a different causal influence.
All right, thank you both. We're going to take a break now, and you get to formulate your questions for Eddie Tabash and Richard Swinburne. We have about 10 minutes. Thank you. Okay, we'll start because we began with Dr. Swinburne presenting. We'll ask the first question of him. Swinburne, your belief is based on the theory from Occam that the simplest answer is generally the best and true answer. And the complicated nature of humanity and the human mind made to have complicated choices. Why should you consider that a simple being would have created a world of complexity?
Well, I gave reasons in each case. It's a characteristic of a very good scientific theory that it can explain a lot of complexity in terms of simplicity. At the end of the 18th century, people knew a lot of truths about which chemical substances interacted with which other chemical substances to give which third chemical substances, but they had no idea of why this is the case. But they knew about thousands of chemical substances of which this was the case. And then chemists in the 19th century said we can explain all this in terms of about 100, a mere 100 as opposed to 1,000, kinds of chemical elements which formed atoms and were linked to other atoms to form molecules and so on. And then they said we can explain all these chemical elements in terms of even smaller number of chemical physical particles. protons and electrons and so on. Now, that was what they were aiming at, and the aim is to explain the complex by the simple. And in the case of God, I gave a reason why he should create many, because each of us is a good thing, many free agents with limited choices as to the good or harm we can do each other, and a whole range of choices and a whole number of ways in which we can make life happy or sad or improve the world or help animals or not help animals. And it's the wider the range of choice and the more possibilities we have and the more kinds of thoughts and feelings and so on we have, the better. And it's a good thing that we shall be able ourselves to grow in knowledge of these things, and this means having laws of nature which are fairly simple and have yet deeper causes which will enable us to discover other things which we can then influence more distant things. So a lot of complexity is all for the good in these ways, and there's a simple explanation of it.
We see the problem with Dr. Swinburne is doing is he's saying, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to substitute in a magical answer for a scientific one. And he's actually trying to say, what he's really doing this evening is saying, if I were God, this is what I think my reasons would be. But there's no proof of any of this. I would think that if there is a God, and God wanted us to have all sorts of options and freedoms, God could have come up with something much better than our clunky physical universe. If we were more disembodied and could float around better, we would have more options. So to say that a physical universe is more likely on an incorporeal disembodied being is something without any evidence. If you look at Dr. Swinburne's Bayesian confirmation theory, and he talks about background information, and he talks about fitting things in with the evidence, well, unless you make his big leap of faith, there is no great background evidence that a physical universe is more likely on prior probability than a non-physical universe. There is no a priori starting point where there is a greater prior likelihood of a deity wanting to imprison us in physical bodies with all the problems that ensues, where the same moral choices could be worked out in a more ethereal environment. So, you see, the thing is that this is just pure speculation, and what Dr. Swinburne is saying is the fact that there's a physical universe is more likely on a supernatural than God, and even if the a priori possibilities are a draw, there is certainly no prior greater likelihood on theism than on atheism that a physical universe would exist, and maybe slightly less.
Mr. Tabash, how does a secular humanist define and explain evil?
A secular humanist, I think, defines and explains evil in many ways, and I think we see it all around us. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to use some of the atrocious things that God supposedly did in the Bible. Now, Dr. Swinburne doesn't think that these literally happened, even though they're in his ultimate revelation. But I would say that if God indeed did order the mass killings of the innocent babies and children of the Amalekites, it was evil, or as Dr. Swinburne would say in his more refined definition of evil, it was a bad act. I think that if God ordered the Israelites to pick and choose among the beautiful captive women and force themselves on them, that was a bad act because it violated their autonomy. I think that evil can be defined in so many ways, but I think a very good definition of evil can be exhibited by Numbers 31, 17, 18, where God orders the Israelites on a certain on one of their invasions to kill all the non-virgins, but to keep the child virgin girls for themselves. Once again, that's ordering mass rape as a pillage of war. So I think that violating the autonomy rights, the dignity and respect of another human being, the atrocities that the Old Testament God committed would be a good example of evil. I also think that overreactions are a good example of evil. And so, for instance, in the book of Numbers, when God orders the man to be put to death because he picked up sticks on the Sabbath, I think that was an overreaction, and it would fit even Dr. Swinburne's definition. So without, in 2 minutes I can't have much, but if we're looking for a definition of evil, I'd say we need to look no further than the acts set forth by God in the Old Testament.
I too don't think the secular humanist has any difficulty in explaining evil, but the theist can at any rate explain why, and do think I mean this literally, and if you think about it, you'll realize I'm right, why there's such a limited amount of evil. That is to say, it only lasts, our lives are short, there are only a limited harm we can do to each other. Now, I'll take the remaining minute to reply on the one or two of the examples that Mr. Tabash put forward. What he said was the point of the girl getting killed by an accidental bullet in Los Angeles, or the lady being bitten by a white shark. Plenty of points. I should think that the girl was killed by a stray bullet in Los Angeles because America is awash with guns. And I should hope that one thing that all our evil always of this kind can always teach us is how to improve things. We learn from them. And if people don't take trouble to keep guns out of the way, this thing is going to happen. And it's the responsibility, I would have thought, of if you'll forgive me putting it this way, legislators and other bodies to stop this sort of thing happening. And therefore it's an act of serious negligence on the part of some people in the United States that this happens. If you don't agree, and if you think that, as it were, there are some more local cause of why the guns are awash in Los Angeles in the terms of the wickedness of the particular people of Los Angeles, then you too have explained it in a way in which humans are to blame, and it results from bad human choices which a generous God has allowed us to make, and the result of that is other people are suffering through his generosity in giving us responsibility for them.
Professor Swinburne, does the hypothesis of theism make falsifiable predictions, like the hypothesis about quarks? What are they? If not, does the hypothesis claim anything meaningful in Popper's sense of scientific propositions? I
think Popper was mistaken about his account of science. What is important about science is that a scientific theory shall be such as to make probable certain observations. It doesn't matter whether the theory was first invented and then you discover the observations, or whether you first discover the observations and then invent the theory. Given that, theism makes plenty of predictions in a non-literal sense. That's to say, it makes probable certain observations, and I went through those in certain detail. The fact that I went through those and then I went through those even though you knew which theory I was going to put forward doesn't mean to say that they don't support the theory. Predictions in a literal sense are not important. What is important is that from the theory, certain data which you would otherwise not expect would probably be found. And you can see that from a simple criminal case. If the detective in the court produces a lot of clues, which he says can all be explained by John having done the crime, it would be very odd for the defense counsel to get up and say, did you invent your theory before you observed the clues, or did you observe the clues first and invent your theory? It wouldn't be relevant. The point is whether the theory leads you to expect the data. advanced prediction is not necessary, but prediction in the sense of making probable a lot of observations which otherwise wouldn't be expected is necessary, and I think I've done that abundantly, and Mr. Tabesh has given absolutely no reason for supposing that the universe would have the kinds of characteristics which I listed on a non-theistic hypothesis. There isn't any reason for supposing, and it's most improbable.
Well, you see, the scientific method is what I'm relying upon, and the scientific method is superior to Dr. Swinburne's absolutism about a divine cause, because whatever people that I would trust would come up with in terms of explanations where Dr. Swinburne just falls back on a magical claim that God did it, whatever the scientists would come up with would be subject to falsifiability. Now, Dr. Swinburne writes that part of his Bayesian confirmation theory requires that the background knowledge contains empirical background knowledge, which is by reference to the teachings of human experience in the physical world. In no other realm other than the postulation of God do we deny falsifiability and testability. So Dr. Swinburne is asking us to do something highly unique. He's saying that in his meta-hypothesis, in the realm dealing only with God, he wants us to abandon the normal course of falsifiability and testability, and he wants us to accept that this is one hypothesis, the most important ever put forward, that can't be falsified or can't be subjected to being tested. Well, he's actually here sinking into a form of religious presuppositionalism by claiming that this is something which is so true a priori that it's not subject to proof, but yet he himself has built his reputation as an evidentialist, saying we have to look at the evidence, and he just rejected another Christian philosopher's call for reliance on faith. And so if Dr. Swinburne is the evidentialist that he says he is, all evidentialist approaches to knowledge, all epistemological efforts require that the hypotheses put forward be testable and subject to falsification. If not, they don't follow the scientific method, and therefore I think Dr. Swinburne's arguments for God are unscientific.
Mr. Tabesh, if someone were about to die, how do you know that God isn't comforting them? Did they come back to life and tell you that God comforted them or did not comfort them?
Well, you see, here's the problem. If indeed God comforts all those about to die, God should give us some indication that that occurs so that we would be able to have some reliable knowledge. We do know people who are brought back from clinical death, and they have no recollection of a God comforting them. Of course, you have your near-death experiences, which, for what we know about the brain and the way it shuts down, are hallucinatory. That seems to be the best possible explanation. But also, people in grave danger of dying don't report. Now, you see, if God is pulling a trick on us and only manifests to those people who will in fact die so they can't come back and give us testimony that God does in fact comfort the about to die in all cases where they really will die, we have another problem of a divine hiddenness, because then God is withholding the evidence necessary for us to have some shred of proof that he exists. See, it would be, again, an excessive hiding the ball for God to say, okay, only those who really die and can never testify to it are going to get the revelation. If God is going to withhold revelation from those of us who need it and give it to only those who can never testify to it, then that is a strong reason for believing the revelation never occurred. And that, once again, is an argument of divine hiddenness, which Dr. Swinburne thinks is necessary, and which I think goes so far that it makes it too difficult to believe in God, makes it, for me, impossible to believe in God, and therefore is evidence of the fact that either God does not exist or God wants me to continue speaking out for atheism.
Yes, this is just another example of the problem of hiddenness. There is a certain amount of hiddenness. I've argued why it's a good thing that there's a certain amount of hiddenness. There isn't total hiddenness. I've given you 20 minutes worth of argument at the beginning of a lot of good reasons for believing in God. And so it's not total hiddenness. But we don't start by knowing everything about God, and we can make progress, and we can help other people, and we can help those who are ill and dying to know about God, just as we can think about it by ourselves and read books, and there's a lot of scope for progress. Now, may I just come back to, as I dare say there's a minute left, to the latest remarks about falsifiability. I don't think Mr. Tabesh took my remarks at all seriously. Falsifiability is not an ideal that is possibly attainable in science. It's always possible to save a scientific theory by postulating some hypothesis or other which will save your theory. If you look through your telescope and you don't find what you see, you postulate that your telescope isn't working properly. If you look through somebody else's telescope and you don't see it, you postulate that there's some dark matter interfering with it. You can always save a theory. No theory is totally falsifiable, but what does happen is that a theory gradually becomes too complicated by postulating these kinds of hypotheses and therefore is dismissed. That, I suggest, is what doesn't happen with theism, and that's why I wish to commend it. The greatest of all scientific theories, Newton's theory of motion, postulated in 1689, made absolutely no new predictions for the next 60 years, but it was universally accepted because it made sense of what we already knew. It made probable all the previous data, and that, I think, should be our attitude to theism as well.
Dr. Swinburne, if God, being entirely rational and omniscient, and therefore knowing what all good things are, and as you say, automatically doing them, is he not then limited by being thus bound to do only good things? And if so, how then is he, as you say, unlimited?
God can do nothing bad, but the range of good things is enormous. There is no best of all possible worlds, because of all the states that God could make, there is always a better. If it's a good thing that people like you should exist, it's a good thing one more person like you should exist. And if you think that would make the world crowded, well, that will put him on another planet. And for all I know, there are many inhabited planets, who knows? But however many there are, it would be better if there's another one. God has before him a range of choices between many equally good things, and a whole range of choices between good things such that whatever he does, there's always a better. And the range is that way enormous. All that he's restricted from doing is something bad.
Well, you see, Dr. Swinburne has written on page 106 of Is There a God that there are limits even to the moral right of God, our creator and sustainer, to use free sentient beings as pawns in a greater game. And yet Dr. Swinburne has said in tonight's debate that there wasn't a single tragedy where we could come up with where he didn't say, well, regardless of how horrible the consequences are to the sufferer was still fortunate because the sufferer played a role in allowing the evildoer to exercise the evildoer's goodwill. Well, that contradicts the passage I just read. So there comes a point where if God does not intervene, even by Dr. Swinburne's own definition, God's lack of intervention is evil because it would exceed God's moral right to use us and let us suffer just so somebody else could play around with their own free will. So certainly there are areas that can be transgressed, and I believe that God has done so. I believe genocide, mass suffering, the Ebola virus, which makes people completely their inner organs melt and are destroyed. I think that the suffering of children in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa and the starvation that's rampant in the world and the abuse and the genocide and the racism, that all of this exceeds the boundaries. So what Dr. Swinburne would have to do is he would have to point to precisely that point that God should not transgress and say, hey, guess what? God has not gone beyond that. But until he can adduce such precise proof and show what the boundaries are, that he cannot say, after writening the passage I just quoted to you, he can't say, oh yes, but God has never crossed that line. I think just looking around the world, we can say that if there is a God, he has crossed that line, which throws his all-goodness and his benevolence into doubt, even if he exists.
Mr. Tabash, if miracles do not happen, then why am I alive today? I have a disease which doctors say once a person is diagnosed with at infancy will die. Then why did I live to be 4 years old before I was diagnosed, and why am I alive today at 30 years of age? I believe I am a living, breathing miracle.
Okay, but you see the problem with that, what about all those people with the same affliction that whoever you are, you have, who haven't lived with it? You see, the very fact that your situation might be unique is that the majority of people with this affliction die. So why should God kill them and allow you to live? The fallacy of this is what I call the Oklahoma City bombing fallacy, where people would say, oh, it was God's will that my child didn't go to a play care center in the Murrah Federal Building because my child would have been blown up. Well, that means it was God's will that the other children did go who were blown up. So to say that it's God's will that you survived this illness and that God has miraculously intervened on your behalf carries within it the implicit statement that the same God obviously then determined not to intervene to save the others. And then we would need some kind of proof as to why you should have been saved as opposed to these others. And unless we can see some kind of proof of that, the best answer from the evidence in our physical world is it's random, that it could have been the other person with this affliction who survived to whatever your age is, and it could have been you who died. You know, the fact that you are the only person to survive the plane crash doesn't mean that God singled you out and determined that the others should die. So if we accept that the universe is random, and we accept the fact that there is no grand designer governing our day-to-day existence, it then becomes more plausible that randomly one person should die when others are killed, and that there is no reason in terms of a special cosmic plan for you to be the survivor of your illness when someone else identically afflicted died.
I'll take my 2 minutes to make one or two further comments on the subject of miracles. Why should God do miracles at all? I've given arguments for supposing that it's a good thing that the universe is a regular and law-governed place, because if it is, then we can make a difference to each other, and God surely wants us to do that. He wants us to understand the laws of biochemistry, and so to cure each other's diseases, and he would rather it happened that way. And so, in general, he's not going to interfere when we've got cancer and so on, because if he did interfere every time we got cancer, then the responsibility for whether people are allowed to die from cancer or not would have been taken away from us. There wouldn't be any scope for doctors. There wouldn't be any scope for medical research. It would all be arranged for us. So why does he do miracles at all? Well, I think for two reasons. First, one would expect a God not to plan things totally in advance, because he wants to interact with us. And therefore, like a good parent who lays down rules for how the house should be governed, occasionally he will yield to a child's wish and pleading to do something slightly different today. And so God may occasionally yield to our pleading to cure somebody who will not be cured by normal laws. But he will do that out of compassion for that particular individual, and he will not do that as a demonstration of his power. Occasionally he has reason to do miracles in order to demonstrate something to us, but that would be a very rare occasion, and in that case the miracle ought to be made very clear. Now, I think there has been one miracle which has been a lot clearer than any other in the history of humanity, and that is the resurrection of Jesus, which I think is relatively well evidenced. And that confirms and the point of that was to demonstrate that Jesus was who he claimed to be. So you wouldn't expect too much evidence for lots of particular detailed answers to prayer, and you don't get it. But you would expect quite a bit of evidence for a big demonstration, and you do get it.
Dr. Swinburne, did God create the devil? And if so, why?
I don't know. I don't know if there is a devil in a literal sense. But let's suppose there is. The traditional view of the devil is that he was created as a good angel who chose to do bad, who chose to rebel against God. And that applies to any other lesser devils there might be. You don't get very much about the devil in the Bible, and you don't get very much about the devil in the early Christian creeds. But the general view, which grew up in Christianity, was that there was a malevolent being, a supreme malevolent being, and lesser ones. But that grew up at the same time as the view that he had become that through his own free choice. And therefore, the explanation of his being bad would be just the same as the explanation of bad humans being bad, that they had chosen this. And God had chosen to give him quite a lot of power, not an infinite amount, but quite a big amount, and he had abused it. And therefore, if it's a good thing that we should have freedom, it's a good thing that he should have had freedom. The same answer can be given.
Well, because I believe there's no God, I believe there's no devil. But I want to go back to what Dr. Swinburne said about resurrection. If, in fact, he believes there's good evidence for the resurrection, then this shows the entire epistemic fallacies and problems that we run into with Dr. Swinburne's supernatural claims. That happened in a very primitive time, 2,000 years ago. Why doesn't it happen today when we have a greater chance of verification? And Dr. Swinburne has written that atonements are very difficult to pull off, and they can't happen too often. But if God is omnipotent, God could do another atonement every 2,000 years. God could have Jesus come back for an encore and do another death and resurrection that would be more evidentially based. And also, if in fact, here again, falsifiability and testability, the resurrection was a singular event. If it was a singular event, it's not repeatable or testable, so God is making it many times much more difficult for us to believe in it. What God should do then is God should make it testable, and God should make it verifiable. God should repeat the resurrection in the way I described in my opening statement, and then give us a fighting chance to believe in it. But you see, the resurrection is implausible because it's the claim of a supernatural event in a pre-scientific era without any actual evidence other than the hearsay of primitives, and it doesn't contain within it any evidentiary manifestations which exist today. There is nothing around today in our physical universe which shows that resurrections from the dead are possible. And that's why, if God did it, God owes it to us to do it again, or God must understand then, knowing human nature, that many of us have good reason not to believe it.
Actually, he is going to two witnesses.
Sorry, is it my turn?
No, that's-
Sorry.
Mr. Tabash, without religious tradition, would ethics and laws have evolved to the point they're at now? Does pure rationalism result in morality?
Well, you see, I think that if you're asking me a historical question, I'd say if we didn't have the religions that we had, that we'd probably have evolved sooner. Because if you look at throughout the Middle Ages, throughout the medieval period, most of the atrocities by organized governments were in the name of religion. For instance, if we didn't have religion, we wouldn't have had the Crusades, and we wouldn't have had the Inquisition. Someone once wrote that more people have had their throats cut over a disagreement as to what will become of them after their throats have been cut than for any other reason. And I think that certainly without people saying, my God is superior to your God, therefore I can kill you, that the majority of the carnage over the centuries would not have taken place. And certainly if you look around the world today, most of the violence in the world today is somehow connected to religion. It wasn't atheists who hit us on September 11th. It were people who held a very strong view of God. And now we have General Boykin saying that when we go into the Islamic countries, we're going to win because our God is superior to their God. So you see, and in Northern Ireland, closer to home to Dr. Swinburne, you have the situation. And certainly religious and religious beliefs play a role in the Middle East. There's not a single suicide bomber who's ever detonated anything in Israel who's been a secular humanist. And so what I think we have to look at is that the way people have used religion has contributed to more irrationality and to more immoral behavior and to more carnage than any other single factor. I'm not saying there aren't single factors. The atheistic communists did a lot of horrible things in the last century. What I'm saying, though, is if you look at the totality of history, throughout history, you would see that from ancient times until today, perhaps the most common individual motivation for one group of people to kill another is a disagreement over the nature and interpretation of the divine being.
Let me remind Mr. Tabash that the two real big calamities of the 20th century were the work of atheists, the Holocaust and the Gulag. He mentioned the Holocaust, and of course that was the work of atheists, and so was the Gulag. So I don't think blame can be put entirely, or indeed in the last century mainly, on religious believers. But of course religious believers have their share of responsibility for atrocities. Indeed they do, and shameful it is too. But the church is meant as a school for sinners and not for saints. As to say, it's meant to help people to be good, and if they disobey the clear teaching of the church on various matters, well, this is indeed bad. But better that there be a great ideal before them that they fail to achieve than that there be no such ideal. Just one remark on the subject of the resurrection. It's all very well throwing this word around primitive times and primitive people, but in fact, the centuries between the 4th century BC and the 4th century AD around the Mediterranean world were some pretty sophisticated people. And they were perhaps the first people in history to have a very clear understanding of historical evidence, the possibility of deceit, and so on. And you get the reports of the resurrection in that climate. And immediately, of course, there arose a different interpretation, a number of different interpretations of what has happened. And these were debated and discussed. And the apostles were very keen to make clear that they had some pretty strong evidence. First, that the body wasn't in the tomb, and nobody indeed ever did produce the body. The Jews claimed that the disciples had stolen it. And St. Matthew records that the Jews believed this. But of course, it's not very likely that the disciples would die for the cause of the resurrection if the body had been stolen by them.
Dr. Swinburne, if God is omnipotent or not omniscient, it goes to say that God is all-pervading, only by boundaries, yet only by boundaries are we able to know something. So my question is, how can one experience God if it is so pervasive we are never able to escape it, to observe?
God is indeed everywhere, but that doesn't mean that we can be aware of him. To say he's everywhere is simply to say that he knows what's happening everywhere and he acts everywhere. That is what it is for a spiritual being to be everywhere. If he chooses, he can make his presence known to us or not. But he's not a physical body which occupies space, and therefore there is no necessity for us to be aware of him where he is. But if he chooses to make himself aware, make himself known to us, then he can.
I think, of course, that this comes right up against the section that I quoted from Dr. Swinburne's book, and that is that there comes a point where God is doing evil if God allows us to become pawns in somebody else's effort to work out their free will. So if God is everywhere, and all of these horrible tragedies that occur on our planet, and all of the pain and the suffering and all the atrocities, and God is always present but chooses not to intervene except in minuscule instances, then God is indeed violating Dr. Swinburne's own edict that there's a point at which we should not be pawns. And to use Dr. Swinburne's analogy of a parent, since he's the one that started using the analogy between the cosmic and the human parent, I can't think of a situation where any parent I know, except somebody who's a real sicko, would watch one of their children do atrocities to another child and then say, hey, guess what? I really can't intervene because of the free will. So if God is every single place in the universe, and God is everywhere and is as permissive of these atrocities, I think we can safely say that God is letting things go too far. And then what would have to happen would be Dr. Swinburne would have to give us much better proof, and I mean much better proof, that there is really life after death, and even to begin a compensatory scheme. And you know what? Even if there is life after death, it doesn't necessarily justify it. If I came up to you and I said, okay, I'm going to break your car, and after I destroy your car, I'm going to give you $10,000, even if that compensates you, that still doesn't make right what I did. So in a certain sense, even compensation in the afterlife doesn't make right unnecessary and unwarranted suffering in this life. That's right.
Mr. Tabash, before the Big Bang, what was in existence to make the Big Bang, and who made the spontaneous bang material? Doesn't it require faith to believe in this hypothesis?
No, it doesn't, because we're not postulating yet what happened, because we don't yet know. The difference between science and theology is when we come up against a point where we say, I don't know, we don't say, aha, we're going to fill in the God of the gaps. Let me give you an example. In Jesus' time, people talked about Jesus doing exorcisms. What happened is that in that primitive era, people thought that mental illness was demonic possession. Today we know better. If we go back even further, we would see people saying, well, you see, the thunder is the angry thunder god that's upset with people, so he's rattling his chains up there. It's the same thing. We don't know the constituent elements of the Big Bang, but that doesn't justify the ultimate God of the gaps to say, okay, there's this magical supernatural being that's created heaven and hell and sent his son to be crucified to atone for human beings in an improbable resurrection, and he's the one that somehow magically jump-started time and space from outside of time and space. You see, if we're going to have competing brute facts, which is what we're doing here, and throughout Dr. Swinburne's books, he's written of God as the ultimate brute fact, and you want an ultimate explanation of everything, well, even your ultimate explanation of everything takes God into inescapable black hole, because then you have to explain God. I mean, how do we come up with a supernatural disembodied being that's existed forever and that thinks without a brain better than any of us? You see, that's even a greater leap of faith. So what I'm saying is my position is more modest and more cautious, and the fact that I don't have all the answers to give you off the top of my head doesn't make my responses any more plausible, and it doesn't justify Dr. Swinburne and other theists' leap into the supernatural magical explanation.
It won't defeat my argument simply by throwing the word magical around. The point is, it's a simple explanation which leads you to expect the data. And I wasn't invoking the fact that the Big Bang was the beginning. There might have been something before the Big Bang, I don't know. But the world might have been everlasting, but that still wouldn't alter the fact that there's a very large world with many things which are behaving in exactly the same way, and it's a world which the laws of nature are conducive to, and the state of the universe, whether at a particular past time or throughout past time, are such as to lead to the evolution of human beings. And it's immensely unlikely, if one just supposes that any particle might do anything, that this would happen. Immensely unlikely. On the other hand, if there is a God, then this is quite likely to happen. And it's characteristic of science to postulate entities, sometimes very strange entities. Look at the quarks, the properties possessed by quarks in some physics books. Very strange entities. We don't see anything like that around us. And yet, the point of why we believe them is because by postulating them, we can explain a lot of things which we do observe. And if that's magic, well, science is magic. And I'm afraid it isn't magic, and the postulating theism to explain these data isn't magic either.
Professor Swinburne, from your argument of God of the Bible, despite its fallacy, is there any way that one can say that one religion based on the Bible is correct and another is not?
Yes, I think so. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus were very remarkable events. Only once among all the great religions, no other religion has had its founder prophet. Now, the unique thing is this conjunction of properties. Live a good and holy life, teach us good moral teaching, claim that his life was an atonement for the sins of the world, give evidence that he believed himself to be God and founded a church, and also his life was culminated by a super miracle. Now, among other religions, Muhammad, Buddha, etc., they lived no doubt good and holy lives, etc., but they didn't claim to be making an atonement for the sins of the world, and they didn't claim to be divine, nor did they claim that their lives were culminated by a super miracle. And while you might doubt the evidence for the resurrection, you might doubt that it was good enough, clearly no other religion had anything like that kind of evidence for it. So if there is one true religion, it's this one. And Mr. Tabash says it isn't enough evidence for the resurrection because it's not a repeatable event. Well, it's a historical event, and historical events by their very nature are not repeatable, but they leave a lot of clues that we can look at. The absence of the body, the testimony of witnesses, not just individual witnesses to have seen the risen Jesus, but groups of witnesses with whom Jesus ate. There's a lot of evidence. And if you're to have one of the religions, it's this one that's backed up by a super miracle.
Yeah. It was very interesting because with all of that, Dr. Swinburne said earlier on that belief in Jesus is not a prerequisite for salvation, and that atheists, Buddhists, Muslims can also be saved. So it's interesting that he believes that the one true correct religion is not mandatory to be believed, and if someone makes a sincere examination of all the religions and chooses another, they will not be damned. So he's saying, in essence, that this is true, but yet you can still get to the same objective even if you choose another path. And you know, that's almost contradictory if in fact Christianity is the one true path and there's atonement only through Jesus, and he embraced the 1963 Vatican II non-exclusivity that all can be saved on their goodness. Now, he talks about the historical evidence. You see, the difference between a historical evidence that's not supernatural and one that is even if the event itself is not repeatable, the genre is. So even if one person will never shoot the same arrow again, the fact that arrows can be shot throughout history is repeatable and falsifiable. We know that those things occur, but resurrections are not. And even if Jesus didn't resurrect, maybe God should come back and resurrect somebody else just to prove to us that resurrections should be can take place. You see, what Dr. Swinburne is confusing is the specific repetition of the event with a category. What I'm saying is that the category of supernatural resurrections are not repeatable, and that's what makes them substance, even if it's someone other than Jesus. If God would all of us start resurrecting a whole bunch of people just to show that resurrections are possible, that would make the story more plausible, but that's not what's happened.
Mr. Tabash, what is your purpose in life if existence ends in this world?
Well, you see, the point is that even if there would be a greater purpose, if my existence did not end, that doesn't make it so. If, in fact, naturalism is true, and if, in fact, there is no God, then we would expect our lives to end at death. But that gives us an even greater responsibility, and Dr. Swinburne likes to talk about responsibility. That greater moral responsibility is that I had better make the very best out of myself and the best out of my life because there's no divine being to do so. So therefore, for instance, I have to make doubly sure that I never drive drunk or go 500 miles per hour down the San Diego freeway, because if I kill somebody, they're not just going to pop into the arms of the Heavenly Father, they're going to be annihilated forever. So the absence of a God, the absence of life after death, makes it even more incumbent on me to help preserve the lives of my brother and sister human beings, to help care for my brother and sister human beings, because if I don't and others don't, there's no one else. So actually, in a sense, there's a greater urgency to do good. There's a greater urgency for us to care for each other because we're all alone in the world. If, for instance, we were on this lifeboat, and we were all kicking back saying, well, you know, the boatman up ahead is going to paddle us to shore, and all of a sudden we see there's no boatman, that he was killed when the ship went down, and we ourselves have to take up the oars or we will drown, then we have a greater obligation to take up the oars. And if I'm the strongest person on the boat, I say, well, there's no great oarsman now, I have to do it so these children don't die and have a fighting chance, and I'm going to strain myself and make sure this boat gets to shore so these children live, because if they drown in these choppy seas, there is no life after death. This is the only shot they get. So to me, my secular humanism, my godless view of the world, makes it incumbent on me to do even more to take care of my brother and sister human beings, because there is no divine fallback. There is no cosmic net under the tightrope. We either take care of each other or we're lost, because there's no granddaddy in the sky to substitute in for us when we fall down on our obligation to care for each other.
Mr. Tabash has just given rather a good argument for a certain amount of hiddenness around. That is to say, as he's pointed out, if we were absolutely certain that God was going to save us when we were drowning, we wouldn't do anything about it. And it's because we have a certain amount of doubt about whether there is a God that we see this as a serious problem which has to be done something about. Now, there are, of course, advantages in non-hiddenness, and I have stressed that. But Mr. Tabash can't have it both ways. He's just given reason why we have serious moral choices when we are somewhat doubtful about the existence of God. And he's therefore given an answer to his own problem about why God doesn't make himself too obvious to us. Just to come back briefly to the resurrection, if the resurrection were repeated frequently and normally, then we would believe it to be a law of nature that resurrections occurred. If we did that, then it wouldn't be a miracle. If it wasn't a miracle, then it wouldn't show that here was a unique action of God giving his signature to the life, death, and death of Jesus. So it's got to be a unique event. That is the way in which God shows that it's he that has interfered here by setting aside his normal way of interfering. But that doesn't mean to say that there can't be quite a lot of evidence for it, which together with other evidence for the existence of God makes it probable that it occurs. God has reason to put his signature to this person's life because God has reason to make atonement for the sins of the world. He's got reason to become incarnate and share our life. And if we put him to death, then he's got reason for raising this person in order to show that he has shared our life. And it's got to be a unique event, therefore, because if it wasn't, it wouldn't be a miracle, it wouldn't have that force. But there's a lot of historical evidence as well, and that's what I was concerned to stress.
That'll do it for our audience questions. Thank you. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. There are plenty of great ones that we simply didn't have time for. We're now going to move on to the closing statements. 8 minutes each, and Professor Swinburne will go first.
Thank you. There are so many points I'd like to make, and they're all pretty separate because they concern various points that Mr. Tabash has made in the course of his presentations. I'd like to go back to the problem of pain and suffering. And I'd like you to do a little bit of thought experiment on this. Mr. Tabash has suggested perhaps if there's a God, he's overdone it. He's given us too much opportunity to hurt each other. He's given us too many diseases to which to choose to react, and so on. But then I ask you to imagine a situation where the diseases had been removed from the world and where there wasn't very much opportunity to hurt each other. There was a bit, but not very much. In that case, we wouldn't be have any opportunity to make serious choices. If we didn't have opportunity to make serious choices, our life would be a great deal the poorer for it, and we wouldn't have the opportunity to take a stand for anything definite that we do. We show ourselves, we show what we are by being heroic in difficult situations. Of course, God would be crazy to give us endless problems in order to give us endless opportunities for heroism. But a number of problems over a short life is valuable for us, and we are fortunate to have that opportunity. Of course, there may be people who suffer in consequence of our misuse of that. And I do repeat that it would be wrong of God to use such people as pawns in a greater game. But, of course, what I also said somewhere around the paragraph which Mr. Tabesh quoted was that it was a good thing to be of use. And this was a good for us that we are of use to someone else. And by our vulnerability to others, we give them the opportunity for choice. Now, in this book from which he quoted, in another book, I did illustrate the kind of thing that was at stake here by a little parable that I told. Imagine yourself in a previous existence having to choose the sort of life that you are to lead in this coming world. And suppose you have a choice between two kinds of life. They're both adult lives in the sense that you have adult kind of thoughts and so on, but they're rather short lives. One is a life entirely on heroin. You have nothing but kicks of pleasure and no interaction with anybody else, and that's the end of it. The other choice is you have a life of pain, but it's a life of childbirth, basically, in which through your pain, someone else comes into existence. You're not obliged to cause that other person to exist because you don't have obligations to anybody until they exist. But it's a good thing that they should come into being. And you are asked to choose in the previous life which would be the best life for you to have led, not the best life for the world or for other people, but the best life for you to have led. Now, I think if you think about it, you will take the second choice, or at any rate, you will think it good to take the second choice, because you will want your life to be of use, and you will realize that your life would be of use if, through a pain, someone else came into existence. And that illustrates the point that even if we are at the mercy of others sometimes and suffer for it, by our vulnerability, we have given them the opportunity, they may not take it, but it's great of them to have the opportunity to make themselves good people through their choice, not through God imposing a character, but through them choosing. And you've given them serious opportunities for choice. And that is a good thing. But of course there are limits, of course there are limits. And Mr. Tabesh has rather suggested where they might be by a rather misleading analogy. He has said, rightly enough, that if parents would be quite unjustified in putting their children in a situation where they were at the mercy of some third party who might beat them up. Sure, but why? But parents have some limited rights over their children. Why do they have limited rights over their children? Well, because they are the source of benefit for their children and can reasonably expect to ask a little back in return for that. And therefore, they may make their children do unpleasant tasks for the sake of not their good, but someone else's good. And they can make their children do that. But of course, there are limits to the sort of tasks they can make their children and the ways in which they can make their children be used to others. And the reason why there are limits is because they're only limited benefactors. That is to say, yes, they are the source of quite a bit of good to their children, but they're given theism, they're only that source because God gave them that power and that responsibility. They only have the ability to benefit their children because God set up the laws of nature, created them, created their children, gave them their children. But God is our benefactor, on the hypothesis under consideration, to a far, far greater extent. He is the very author of our being. He gives us life. He gives us the world in which we are. Everything we have is due to him. And if it comes via other people, it's still ultimately due to him. So he can ask rather a lot of us. He's got enormous rights because he's given us so much. But of course, there are limits. He mustn't, on balance, be a benefactor. If he gives us a lot and takes back a bit, okay. But if he gives us a lot and takes back more, no. But that's the point of the afterlife being mentioned. Of course, God ought not to let anybody suffer unless that is necessary for a greater good. But the greater good may be to somebody else. My suffering may be of use to you. But if that is the situation, then I am fortunate to be of use to you. But if nevertheless, as it were, on balance, I've given back, God has taken back more good from my life than he has given me, then he will compensate. And that is surely okay, just as we would not think it wrong to do a serious operation on a fetus for the sake of the ultimate good of the fetus, or even of the ultimate good of someone else. We wouldn't think it wrong just because it happened during the first bit of the fetus's life. Likewise, God might give us, occasionally, some of us, on balance, a bad life in this world, so long as it was of use for a greater purpose, so long as he ultimately gave us over eternity a good life. That is the answer to the problem of evil. But that having been dealt with, I suggest to you that the previous arguments for the existence of God from all that evidence, which is utterly inexplicable, couldn't be explained by science. Most improbable if there is no God, but very probable if there is a God, is strong evidence for the existence of God. Thank you.
Well, as a practical matter, if I believed in the all-good, all-powerful God that Dr. Swinburne does, I wouldn't spend an additional $6,000 a year on earthquake insurance on my home. And I think what we have to do is we have to look to what are the physical manifestations in the physical universe of an all-good, all-powerful God. First of all, we have the problem of divine hiddenness, and Dr. Swinburne says, I can't have it both ways, he can't have it both ways. He writes extensively about a book of Revelation, which we're supposed to believe contains the ultimate truth, even though it's deeply flawed, and yet he says it's okay for God to make the book so flawed and the revelation so difficult to believe and so distant in the past as to make reasonable non-belief understandable. Well, if reasonable non-belief is understandable, then atheists like me, who have searched all our lives, will be forced to conclude that there is no God. Now, it's interesting that Dr. Swinburne, and I appreciate the fact that he's not a fundamentalist, that Dr. Swinburne says that this is the ultimate revelation, but yet you're not required to believe it for salvation. So that's an interesting point. So that means that it's okay with God if many of us fail to be able to believe this ultimate revelation because God himself withholds evidence of it. Well, if God's going to go to the trouble of having Jesus resurrect in the first place, I think that God would want to make more effort to make sure that so many of us would have a better fighting chance of believing in it, and God would be able to see that rationalists like me have great difficulty in believing these supernatural miracles, and therefore I think God wouldn't be so hidden. But yet nevertheless God is, which to me is inconsistent with God's existence. Now, Dr. Swinburne says that the child is less likely to exercise free will knowing that the parent is looking in the window. But you see, there's a difference between that and the child feeling the parent isn't there at all. And that's the problem with divine hiddenness. It's not that, okay, well, God's not looking in the window right now, so I'm going to exercise my free will. It's what am I going to do if I have no evidence that the parent exists? Now, Dr. Swinburne says because God created us, God has many rights to use us however God will, even if it means that we're going to be used for the spiritual or moral growth of someone else by allowing that someone else to experiment evil on us. Well, at the same time, Dr. Swinburne says there comes a point at which it would be wrong of God to allow us to be used as pawns in somebody else's game of developing their moral character. But Dr. Swinburne doesn't say what that cutoff point is. You see, Dr. Swinburne would need to be able to say, okay, at this point, what God did has gone too far. But you see, he admits the theoretical possibility of it, but says it can never happen, and I believe you look around the world and see it already can happen. Now, let's say that I were to create a race of sentient robots in my laboratory. The fact that I created them doesn't mean I have a right to torture them or a right to cause them great pain and suffering. So the fact that God brings a little baby into existence doesn't mean that God has a right to have that little baby's arms chopped off by an invading army so the invading army can learn, it's best to be more cautious and not to sweep with so broad a brush when we invade something, you know. And the little boy in Iraq, the little 10-year-old boy who had both his arms blown off during the first few weeks of the military activity there, shouldn't go running up to the American soldiers and say, I'm so happy I was able to be a sacrifice in your learning how to aim your bombs better. See, that is actually the upshot of what Dr. Swinburne says. And if you look in the background of the failure to prove the supernatural, this becomes more evidence. I'd like to draw an analogy, and that's to the leprechaun in the attic. If there is a noise, and I say, well, that noise is caused by a leprechaun in the attic, and you say, there's no proof of that, and I say, well, you have to prove that it's something else, because this kind of noise is a kind of noise that only comes with a leprechaun because it's somebody giggling and saying snide remarks in an Irish accent, and yet when we go up there, we find nobody there, so it's the invisible, very powerful leprechaun. You would say, well, you have to prove it. It's the same thing with the supernatural. Remember, Dr. Swinburne, though he denies the magical, is actually participating in the magical because he's participating in the supernatural, and the supernatural is really nothing more than the magical writ very large. And what Dr. Swinburne is saying is that we cannot explain the physical without explaining the supernatural. Now, he argues that he doesn't say that God must necessarily exist, but he skirts dangerously close to it when he believes that the best explanation for anything physical is something supernatural. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. What he's in effect saying is when I look out at natural laws, I believe they can only come about if there's a supernatural foundation. But he doesn't yet explain how that supernatural foundation interacts with the natural laws. Now, he never answered my questions about the improbability of life after death, showing how uniquely dependent conscious awareness is on the physical brain. See, if it were true that soul consciousness were to contain the seat of our consciousness and be survivable independent of the brain, why does the evidence show contrary? Why do people with Alzheimer's disease lose their conscious awareness? Why does an anesthetic wipe out our conscious awareness entirely? Why does it happen that, for instance, if you remove certain parts of the brain, you remove entire realms of memory? Dr. Swinburne says that when we die, we survive. The usness survives. Well, who is that? And how much of that is who we are today? If even brain surgery can excise and destroy whole memories of my life, won't the destruction of the entire brain leave nothing left? I mean, how will I say in the next life without a brain, oh, this is Eddie Tabash, I'm the guy that used to practice law in the Los Angeles area and debate Christians in my free time? How will I even remember that if I don't have a physical brain? And insofar as his cosmology is concerned and his falsifiability, he says that science is never really falsifiable. Yes, it is on an incremental basis. Every time one theory is rejected for the other, it's because it's testable and therefore falsifiable. Dr. Swinburne has given us no basis by which to say that theism is testable or falsifiable. Now, it's interesting. He says that God is not necessarily true, but most probably true, or more probable than not, but yet he shows us no way of falsifying or testing that theory. And if we are to be able to come to believe that there's a God, we should be able to falsify or testify that theory. So if all of you levitated right now to the ceiling and I had no other explanation, and I ran under you and there were no strings holding you up, and I went over you and there were no strings pulling you up, I'd say, okay, you see, there happens to be a supernatural event going on here until science further explains it, but so far, this is supernatural. So if you look at the totality of the physical universe, the absence of direct proof of miracles, the absence of direct violations of the laws of nature by miracles, and Dr. Swinburne says they can't happen too often. Well, I would say, you know what, if something is miraculous, it can happen more than once. That's not happening too often. A few repetitions would still give us a greater basis for belief. So I ask you, look at the totality of the physical universe, the hard physical universe, and you will see there is no supernatural, there is no magic. We live in a naturalistic universe. There is no God. Thank you.
That's going to do it for our event tonight. I want to thank Professor Richard Swinburne, Edward Tabash for coming all the way to Missoula, Montana to share their views with us. Thank my co-moderator, John Rozelle of Campus Crusade for Christ. I'm Justin Whitaker of the UM Philosophy Society. Thank you all.